The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Questions to the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Mr. Gavin Shuker.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One person sleeping on the streets is one too many. That is why we committed to spending over £550 million to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping in England. This includes supporting 84 projects through our £50 million homelessness prevention programme, an end-to-end approach to tackling homelessness and rough sleeping.
Mr. Gavin Shuker.
Mr. Speaker, since joining this House in 2010, I've seen with my own eyes the incredible increase in those people that are sleeping roughly on our streets. I've seen it in my constituency, the places that I've been around the country, and indeed on the doorsteps of Westminster itself when we come and leave for votes. Can he tell me what changed in 2010?
Mr. Speaker, firstly, the honourable gentleman may know that statutory homelessness acceptances are below their peak, less than half of their peak in 2003. But of course there is more to do, especially when it comes to, as he points out, when it comes to rough sleeping. And I've seen that as well. I've seen it throughout the country. I've seen it also here in Westminster. There is a lot more to do, and the honourable gentleman may know that just last week I said a lot about this at the anniversary conference of the 50th anniversary conference of Crisis, where I said that ending rough sleeping is within our gift. It is something that we can do much more on. It is something we must do, and working together, it is something that we are going to do.
Mark Prisk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many people are concerned that the general election might result in the delay of implementing the homelessness reduction bill. Perhaps the Secretary of State could say what progress has been made so far. And given that this is a bill that has cross-party support, can this work not continue during the election period?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to assure my honourable gentleman, first of all, I'd like to again take this opportunity to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Harrow East, for all the work he did to bring that bill forward and to get it through Parliament. There are still a couple of one final stage through the parliamentary process, which we're very confident about. But we have already started work with local authorities to make sure that that bill comes into force straight away.
Karen Buck.
Speaker, in my home borough of Westminster, referred to, including at Westminster Station, where we see rough sleeping has soared. Westminster Council alone has a third of all of the rough sleepers in London. Westminster Council has just cut, indeed slashed, its rough sleeping budget. Does the Minister believe this will help or hinder efforts to reduce rough sleeping?
Mr. Speaker, we are providing more funds to councils across the country, including Westminster Council, to combat rough sleeping. So, for example, there's £100 million to deliver 2,000 independent living units, and also the £20 million grant for rough sleeping. But as I've said earlier, I do want to do more. This government is determined to do more. A few weeks ago, I went to Finland to see what they've done for themselves and the Housing First project, and I think we can learn lessons from others and make sure we do more at home.
Ben Howlett.
Mr. Speaker, since 2015 I've led a range of different homelessness roundtables in Bath, bringing together charities such as Genesis Trust, DHI and Julian House, which have all received government funding. Does my honourable friend agree with me that integration of services are absolutely critical to solving this problem, and that residents in Bath should back my plan in order to help solve this problem?
Mr. Speaker, I do very much agree with my honourable friend, and let me commend also the work that he has done locally, which is very well known, to try and bring these services together. And I am pleased to tell him that with Swindon, Wiltshire, Bath and North Somerset, they will benefit, I think, some £259,000 from a rough sleeping grant to help promote integration.
John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scale of rough sleeping homelessness in Britain today shames us all. And in a country as decent and well off as ours, it is not inevitable. But the level has more than doubled since 2010, directly as a result of the decisions that Conservative ministers have made since then. And, Mr. Speaker, there are very few simple rules in politics, but this is one. With a Labour government, homelessness falls. Under the Tories, it goes up. And on June the 8th, people will ask themselves, do we really want more of the same? And I say to the Secretary of State, with a new national mission, he need not go to Finland. Before the election, will he commit his party to match our Labour commitment and back our Labour plans to end rough sleeping by the end of the next Parliament?
Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable gentleman. He cares deeply about this issue, as we do on this side of the House, and he shouldn't play party politics with it. This is This, Mr. Speaker, is a very serious issue that unites everyone in this House. We all want to see an end to rough sleeping, but he knows, the honourable gentleman knows as well as I do, that the causes of rough sleeping are complex. They are not just economic, there are mental health problems, there are addiction problems, and the honourable gentleman knows that. And we do have lessons to learn from abroad, but I'm sure that if he works with us, if we work together, that we can all unite in helping rough sleeping for good.
John Healey.
Mr. Speaker, this is precisely about politics. It is precisely about the political decisions made over the last 7 years that have made the causes of homelessness so much worse. And rapidly rising homelessness is just the tip of the iceberg on 7 years of failure on housing. Rough sleeping doubled, home ownership down, house building falling, private renters ignored, housing benefit bills ballooning, and now the lowest level of new affordable homes to build, to rent and buy for 24 years. No wonder Labour is ahead in the polls on housing. And after 7 years of failure, the Tories have no plan to fix the housing crisis. Isn't that why, Mr. Speaker, people now desperately need a new deal on housing led by a new Labour government?
Mr. Speaker, I did think if anyone was going to raise the opinion polls today, it would come from this side of the House, but the right honourable gentleman continues to surprise us all. But I say again to him, let's work together on rough sleeping. It's very easy for Labour to make a commitment to end rough sleeping without having any plans, any initiative, anything in hand to show what they would actually do about it. We've got the ideas, we've got new ideas, and especially when it comes to, for example, the Housing First concept, which we are trialling already right now in Liverpool, and the honourable gentleman has the opportunity to work with us if he really means it.
Maskell.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we have doubled the level of small business rate relief to 100% and made it permanent. This means that around 600,000 small businesses will pay no business rates at all. At budget, we also announced a £300 million discretionary fund so councils can provide additional support to businesses facing increased bills.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, York's economy is being damaged by sharp business rate increases due to the revaluations, while exemption from paying the full business rates has risen from 12,000 to 15,000. Business rate increases rocketed far beyond that in York. This is totally unfair for small businesses previously exempt and now desperate in the city. Some are facing 600% increases in their rateable value, like the slip-in, and no one knows how the new relief funds will even be distributed. Total chaos. Can the Secretary of State say why the business rate burden is falling harder on smaller businesses, and if he will urgently review the exemption level?
Well done.
Mr. Speaker, overall, businesses in the north have seen an average fall through the revaluation process. The honourable lady talks about York. York, since 2010, has seen a 74% fall in unemployment. A 74% fall in unemployment. And that's because you've got a Conservative York-led council working with a Conservative government. And if the Labour Party gets its anti-business agenda and hikes up taxes on business throughout the country, we know what the result will be.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister aware that many Labour-controlled councils are still pursuing anti-car policies? Will he remind them of recommendation number 9 of the Mary Portas Retail Review, which stated that free and available parking, but controlled parking, should be made available to high street shoppers?
Mr. Speaker, as always, my right honourable friend has made a very good point about anti-car policies coming from Labour councils, where councils have worked with businesses and taken a pro-car policy, especially when it comes to parking. It has helped local businesses, and Labour can learn a lesson from that.
To Roberta Blackman-Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the very great concern expressed by small businesses up and down the country about their ability to pay business rate rises, I'm going to give the Secretary of State another chance. What reassurance can he give small business owners who are concerned about the impact of rate rises that they will not be paying higher rates over the next few years than online and large retailers such as Sports Direct?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable lady two things. First of all, I can point her to the package that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, announced at the budget, £435 million of additional help for small businesses with rates, including the £300 million discretionary fund, for which there will be absolutely no delay because of the general election. It's going ahead exactly as planned. Indeed, the government has already confirmed the final allocations to all local authorities, and local authorities are free to start using that scheme and helping local businesses. And secondly, I can point her to what my right honourable friend, the Chancellor said in the budget, where he said, and I quote, "In the medium term, we have to find a better way of taxing the digital part of the economy and that does not use bricks and mortar, and we also need to look at the frequency of the revaluation process."
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many small businesses in Bury are going to see a fall in their business rates as a result of the revaluation. But because of phasing, it's going to be some years before they receive the full benefit. Can I ask my right honourable friend to look again at what can be done to speed up the introduction so that they can feel the full benefit?
Mr Speaker, what I can tell my friend is that we've also put in place the transitional relief scheme, which is worth over £3 billion, which will help businesses across the country, including in his home constituency, and it will certainly speed up the introduction.
Gavin Robinson.
Mr Speaker, at the last occasion of communities and local government questions, I asked the Secretary of State to engage with me and Belfast City Council as to how best we could help grow business through a city deal. He kindly agreed, but sadly events have overtaken our arrangements. Can I therefore ask the Secretary of State, with the commitment he has shown to spread city deals throughout the devolved regions, that is a continuing theme and something he would like to see continue with communities and local government?
Mr Speaker, I'd be very happy to meet the honourable gentleman and be happy to meet him before Parliament prorogues.
Lucy Allen.
Question 3, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, in September 2016, we announced the extension of the local housing allowance exemption for supported housing until April 2019. We recently consulted on a reform funding model for supported housing. We are not doing this to save money. We want to get the right model to deliver improvements in the quality and the value of money going forward.
Lucy Allen.
I thank my right honourable friend for his reply. Telford has some excellent supported housing schemes, many of which I have been to visit, including Rose Manor in Ketley and Vicarage Grove in Dawley. Supported housing costs can often be higher than local housing allowance rate. How would the government's reforms address this concern?
My honourable friend, Mr Speaker, makes a very good point. Last September, we announced that we would devolve funding to local authorities so that providers could, where necessary, reflect the higher average costs of supported accommodation. This would give local authorities an enhanced role in commissioning supported housing in their area.
5 bets.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State is aware of the Select Committee inquiry into funding proposals for supported housing. Will he give an assurance that he will reflect very carefully on the overwhelming evidence we've received, which says that the LHA rates are not an appropriate basis on which to devise a funding scheme for supported housing?
Here.
Mr Speaker, I can tell the Chair of the Select Committee, first of all, the Government hugely values the role of supported housing and what it plays in the lives of helping vulnerable people. I take very seriously what the Select Committee has to say. I know my honourable friend, the Local Government Minister, gave evidence to that inquiry, so I will look at it carefully. And I do want to make sure that whatever the final model is, that it incentivises and makes sure that providers continue providing this very important type of housing.
Mr Kevin Hollingray.
Mr Speaker, I very much welcome the commitment to support the supported housing and the extra monies devolved to local authorities for that. But the local housing allowance cap significantly favours London over the regions. For example, 99% of tenancies in my region will require top-up from that fund, only 3% in London. Would the Secretary of State agree to look at this again and make sure we have a system of supported housing that works for everyone?
Mr Speaker, I know that my honourable friend takes a strong interest in this area, and also I know he's done so as a member of the Department Select Committee. I've listened to him carefully. Others have made similar points to those my honourable friend just made during the consultation process. What I can assure him that we will look at all the responses very carefully and make sure that the final system works for everyone.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Select Committee inquiry has received evidence that the Government's approach to supported housing is causing many providers to put new schemes on hold and some to pull out of providing supported housing altogether. When will the Secretary of State accept the damage his policy is doing to the provision of housing for our most vulnerable residents, and when will he commit to the funding and certainty the sector needs to provide the supported homes that we need in the future?
Mr. Speaker, it is important that we take a careful look at this policy precisely because we all want to see a sustainable model that leads to providers providing enough of these types of homes. And that's exactly what this policy is designed to do. And when we come out with the final policy, that's what it will achieve.
Will Quince.
4, Mr. Speaker. On the 18th of April, 20 leading members of the British Property Federation pledged to offer 3-year tenancies in build-for-rent developments. Leading housing associations have made a similar pledge, and we hope this will encourage a shift in the market towards more landlords offering longer tenancies.
Quince.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of renters in Colchester and across the country will welcome that news. But does the Minister agree with me that landlords are only half of the issue, and in fact getting mortgage lenders, 50% of which at the moment do not lend on more than a year's AST, to change that policy will be the key to unlocking this and longer tenancies for the future?
Well, my honourable friend is quite right to raise this issue of security for people in the private rented sector, and he's also right to identify the issue in relation to lending. Since the government introduced its model tenancy agreement with appropriate break clauses, there is no longer any impediment permitting longer tenancies for their landlord customers, and the majority now permit tenancies of up to 2 to 3 years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Minister had visited Cambridge recently, he'd see the manifestation of the housing crisis in a number of people sleeping on the streets, which so depresses residents and those people. When I visited Winter Comfort, one of the leading charities recently, they told me that landlords are increasingly unwilling to let to people on housing benefit because of insecure employment. Would he agree with me that cracking down on insecure employment would help us tackle the housing crisis?
Well, I had the opportunity to visit Cambridge very recently. I share his diagnosis of what the problem is. We desperately need to build more homes in this country to give people more choice, and I think he's also right about our employment market. But I would say to him, it's the policies of this government that have driven record levels of employment, and it's the national living wage that's increasing people's spending power.
Mr. Speaker, both landlords and tenants often mistakenly believe that the tenancy has to be 6 months or a year renewable, when of course there is no legal impediment to people having longer tenancies, and in some cases they do. But one of the reasons that it doesn't happen is landlords often find it difficult to recover possession if they need to occupy the house themselves, or if the tenant fails to pay their rent. Would the Minister consider making it easier for landlords to recover occupation to encourage them to provide longer tenancies?
Friend is quite right. We also need to make sure that actually when a tenant behaves antisocially or is behind on rent arrears, that landlords can regain possession. But the fundamental pressure that we face at the moment is giving the increasing number of families that are in the private rented sector the security they need, and reforming our housing market, increasing the supply and bringing in these new build-to-rent schemes that will offer the longer tenancies, Mr. Speaker, is a key reform.
Bruce Laughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour councils like Newham, Redbridge, Greenwich and my own borough of Hamilton and Fulham are doing a fantastic job cracking down on rogue landlords. If he actually cares about private tenants, why is this minister blocking borough-wide private sector licensing schemes? Is his party still the slum landlord's friend?
That's terrible. Absolutely. Yeah, can't even keep a straight face. Get your pear. Terrible.
Mr. Speaker, the suggestion that members on this side of the House don't care about these issues is as ridiculous as it is insulting. The work of Labour councils that the Shadow Minister refers to is being funded by funding often from this government. He is factually wrong to suggest that this government is blocking borough-wide selection licensing. And I could also point out to him the many reforms we're introducing, banning letting agent fees, insisting on client monetary protection, reforms that when the Shadow Housing Minister was running this department were not in place.
Lady Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Number 5.
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to protecting and boosting the supply of supported housing, and since 2011 we have delivered 23,000 new supported homes in England. My honourable friend will know we recently consulted on a reformed funding model. We are now keen to press on with this reform as soon as possible.
Lady Allen.
Thank you. I'd like to probe a little further, if I may, on emergency short-term accommodations such as women's refuges. Does the Minister agree that a totally separate funding stream is essential to honour our ambition, that is, no victim be turned away from accessing critical support services by 2020?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend highlights a very important point. We have been working with the sector to develop options to ensure providers of short-term accommodation continue to receive the appropriate funding. Now, this may be through a different funding mechanism that we have today, but I believe that it is vital that this housing part of supported housing receives the protection it deserves, and it will.
Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State knows that he's let down elderly people in this country. It's not just supported housing, it's not just funding, it's the fact in a constituency like mine, we have a magic wand where suddenly student accommodation rises like daisies in the spring. But when it comes to accommodation for elderly people who desperately need it, with an ageing population, he has been nowhere in what he's achieved. That's right.
The Council. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the honourable gentleman just missed what I said, but since 2011, 23,000 units of specialised and general housing have been delivered for vulnerable people, and we provided another £400 million for specialist homes throughout the country. That's the kind of action that makes results, and he should welcome it.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In evidence to the Joint Committee, David Orr of the National Housing Federation said that LHA was not a competent starting point for a funding model. Can the Secretary of State tell the House, is he wedded to LHA as a starting point, or is he considering some other option?
Here. Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the honourable lady is that when it comes to supported housing, we have just had a consultation which is now closed. We've had a number of representations on that, and we want to consider them carefully. But whatever the final model is, it will be one designed to make it sustainable for the long term and provide the supported housing that we need.
Alison Thewlis.
I look forward to hearing the Government's response on that, and it would be useful to get a date on that issue. On the issue of the different types of supported accommodation that are being consulted on, does the Secretary of State recognise that placing an arbitrary time limit on the length of time somebody is in short-term accommodation could have a detrimental effect on their life chances thereafter if they are forced to leave that supported accommodation too soon? Will he allow flexibility in the system so that organisations like Emmaus or Blue Triangle in my constituency are able to keep people for as long as they need to be there?
Here, here.
Mr. Speaker, as part of the review and the response to the consultation, we are considering exactly that point that the honourable lady raises, which is the terms of access to short-term accommodation.
Anna Turley.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker. In 2015-16, Mr. Speaker, around 685,000 socially renting households were either currently in arrears or had been in the last 12 months. That represents 25% of households in the social rented sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That seems a huge amount.
Yes, it does.
That's nearly a quarter of people in social housing rent arrears. In my constituency, in one ward alone, however, we have nearly half of our social housing tenants, 46% in rent arrears. One single mum, for example, has seen her rent jump from £8 to £70 a week because of the benefit cap, and the bedroom tax is still wreaking devastation. Yeah. Isn't this a damning indictment of 7 years of Tory assault on Britain's struggling families?
That's right, Anna.
The first year, Mr. Speaker, in which the data was collected in 2011-12, it was 23.5%, so the figures are very similar to the level that they were when inherited from the Labour government. In relation to the benefit gap, this side of the House believes very clearly that it is completely wrong for out-of-work households to receive a level of support far in excess which their working neighbours earn when they go out to work. Discretionary housing payments are in order, and I could also say to her that actually the level is falling. In 2013-14, it was 30% of households, so the figures are moving in the right direction, and she is wrong to oppose the fundamental welfare reforms we need to make sure the system is fair.
Those tenants in the social housing sector who don't keep up with their rents are, of course, in danger of becoming homeless. Will my honourable friend pay tribute to councils like Kettering Borough Council, of which I'm a member, who make it an absolute priority to help people in those situations from becoming homeless in the first place? And in the first 5 months of this year, Kettering Borough Council have helped 78 households stay in their present accommodation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be very happy to pay tribute to the work that Kettering Borough Council have done, and I can also reassure my honourable friend that from the government's point of view, the MOJ's protocol for social landlords stresses the value of preventative measures in rent arrears and advises landlords to deploy alternative approaches to eviction wherever possible.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister whether he's had discussions with his colleagues in the DWP about universal credit and the impact this is having upon many of my constituents who are not being paid for weeks, sometimes months on end, and therefore going into arrears? This is in addition to being hit by the bedroom tax and other benefit changes. So can I ask him again whether he's had discussions or whether he will have discussions, because it's a disgrace what's going on in my constituency.
Mr Speaker, we certainly have had discussions with DWP colleagues. I'd make two very brief points to the honourable member. First, universal credit advances are available for new claims, and that should be taken up. But secondly, DWP research shows that after 4 months, the proportion of universal credit claimants who were in arrears at the start of their claim had fallen by a third. So there is an initial problem, and the advance claims are there to cope with that, but actually over time the situation is improving.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Speaker, in Northern Ireland, 1 in 3 people are just a paycheck away from homelessness, a lesser number in the UK mainland. Can I ask the Minister what steps have been taken to help those on the cusp of homelessness due to the benefit system and hold on to their tenancies?
The Government has significantly increased, Mr Speaker, the discretionary housing payments that are available to local authorities to assist those who are affected by welfare reform changes to try and ensure that's happened. And the whole emphasis of the policy that my honourable friend is working on is to try and shift the approach to an emphasis on prevention, so that we prevent people becoming statutorily homeless in the first place, rather than just providing help at the point of crisis.
Number 7, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This Government is committed to reforming unfair parking practices. We have already taken steps to tackle rogue and unfair practices by providing private parking operators, even, Mr Speaker, including the banning of wheel clamping and towing. This department published a summary of responses to its discussion paper on private parking in 2016, and I am considering the points that were raised.
Caulfield.
I thank the Minister for his response. In Lewis, in my constituency, the discrepancy between parking on public and private land is causing huge problems for drivers in my constituency and hefty fines. I'm thinking particularly of the area behind Laura Ashley at the town centre, where stopping for 2 minutes will see you receive a £60 penalty fine. Could the Minister bring forward the recommendations from the consultation to end this unfair practice?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My honourable friend is a strong campaign of her constituents. She raises an important point. People do need clarity on knowing where they can and cannot park. I certainly recognise the anger that her constituents are feeling in this regard. We'll certainly look carefully at what she says as we prepare our response to the consultation.
Mr William Ragg.
Number 8, sir. Thank you, Mr Speaker. 2,000 pubs have been listed so far on the assets of community value. That listing, of course, provides those communities with time to bid for a pub if it comes onto the market. We're also supporting that process further with £3.6 million through the More Than a Pub programme.
William Ragg.
I thank my honourable friend for that reply. The Northumberland Arms in Marplebridge is a much-loved local pub, which members of the local community are hoping to reopen using the community right to bid scheme. Will my honourable friend lend every possible support and consider joining us for a celebratory pint when it reopens? We could indeed make this a double celebration should the good people of Marplebridge see fit to return me to this House. Mr Speaker, it is unthinkable that the people of Hazel Grove will not return my honourable friend, given his work on behalf of them these past 2 and a bit years. I'd be delighted, of course, to join him with the whole ministerial team to celebrate the community pub he mentions, so long as he is buying the pints.
Mr Greg Mulholland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister has failed to mention what my office has been told by the Department, which is that the Neighbourhood Planning Bill is set to fall, and therefore the change to pubs protection would not happen. Could we have an assurance that this is not the case? Because after that wonderful decision, supported across the House, we need to make sure this goes through.
That's right,
Mr Speaker, my understanding is that we are hoping to complete that legislation before the dissolution of Parliament. But that change he mentions has been broadly welcomed by very many people, including himself, of course, who campaigned on it.
Mr David Hanson.
9, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, since April 2010 we have delivered on average over 50,800 affordable homes per year, 36,300 of which were affordable homes for rent. During the previous government, the annual average was only 42,900, of which only 28,700 were homes for rent.
Mr David Hanson.
I'm expecting, Mr Speaker, a number of members of Parliament and ministers to visit Delling constituency in the next few weeks. Yeah. So could I invite the honourable gentleman to come with me to Flint, where he will see a Labour council building council houses for rent, social housing, supported by the Welsh Assembly, over 600 houses in one constituency alone. Why can't he match that in England?
Mr Speaker, as I was just saying, and contrary to what the Shadow Housing Minister had to say, under this government, higher levels of affordable housing are being delivered than were under the last Labour government. But if his council is delivering new council homes, I'm very glad to hear that. We want more homes of every kind, and I can tell him that in Croydon, it was a Conservative council that started building council housing again after a Labour council had failed to do so.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will my honourable friend join with me in welcoming the almost 2,000 new houses currently being built in Crawley's Forge Wood neighbourhood, which includes a complete mix of units, including council and social rented, as well as low-cost housing?
Mr Speaker, I warmly welcome what my honourable friend has to say and his support for building the homes that we so desperately need in this country. Contrary to what we often hear from the shadow front bench, there is actually across the country a widespread consensus that we desperately need to build more homes of every kind to tackle the housing crisis that has been building in this country for the last 30 or 40 years.
Carol Monaghan.
Mr Speaker, the Right to Buy scheme has allowed a devastating erosion of social housing stock, with 40% of ex-council houses now in the hands of private landlords. With public money going straight into the pockets of these landlords, could the Secretary of State tell the House how much the Right to Buy scheme has cost the public purse?
Mr Speaker, the Right to Buy has helped nearly 2 million hard-working people own their own home in this country. And since we reinvigorated the Right to Buy in 2012, we've made it a condition of the scheme that for each home that is sold, we replace it with a new affordable home. And that, to my mind, is the right policy, that we help people that have the aspiration to buy their home, but we also make sure that the rented homes are replaced. And that's what people will get from a Conservative government.
Mr Gelvin Hopkins.
Mr Speaker. Luton's housing waiting list is now 3 times higher than it was in the 1970s when I was Vice Chair of the Housing Committee on the Council. The housing stock has actually halved in that time from compulsory sales. Isn't the truth that only a Labour government led by my right honourable friend, the member for Islington North, will save Britain's housing situation and make sure that people in Luton can have a decent home?
That's right.
Well, I think, Mr Speaker, people can look back at the record of the last Labour government from 1997 to 2010. How many council homes were built then? What level of house building did we inherit from the Labour government in 2010? The truth, Mr Speaker, is that house building in this country has been increasing under this government. There is certainly still further to go, but we are the party that is committed to building more homes for people to buy, more homes for people to rent privately, and more affordable homes for people to rent. And if we want a solution to the housing crisis, it is this party that is offering it.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Number 10, sir.
Mr Speaker, my department regularly meets with housing associations to discuss how we can help keep rents affordable and increase the supply of new homes. Our housing white paper has been welcomed by the sector and we look forward to many more productive discussions in the coming years.
Stephen Hammond.
An honourable friend for that answer. Indeed, the housing paper has been welcomed by housing associations. Will you agree with me that the future rent policy should not only guarantee affordability, but offer long-term certainty for the housing associations so that they do deliver those more homes we need?
Yes, Mr Speaker, I do agree with my honourable friend. It's an excellent point. Housing associations currently account for roughly about a third of total housing supply, and we do want a situation where they can borrow even more against that future income to build even more homes. This is something that's in the housing white paper, and we tend to build on it.
Ray Williams. Mr Williams? Not here. Mrs Emma Lewell-Buck.
Number 12, please, Mr Speaker.
That's right.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Adult social care funding is distributed according to the relative need of different areas using a well-established formula. The majority of the £4.5 billion for social care announced at the 2015 spending review and spring budget takes into account councils' ability to raise money through the social care precept.
Lewell-Buck.
I thank the Minister for that response, but I'm sorry, he's wrong. The formula is broken. South Tyneside Council are the third hardest hit council in the country, with a low council tax base, demand for adult social care higher than average, and our hospital services under threat from this government's forced STP plans. Isn't it just simply true that this government created the social care crisis, can't solve it, and our constituents are suffering as a result?
That's right, Emma, you tell her. Well, I can say to the honourable lady that her assessment is completely wrong. £9.25 billion of extra funding that councils will have access to over the next 3 years. In terms of the money that's coming directly from the government, it absolutely takes into account a local area's ability to raise council tax, and therefore areas like the honourable ladies will receive more in funding from the government than some other areas. And in relation to council tax, I don't think the honourable lady's got any space to talk about that, because council tax doubled during the Labour government's time since 2010. It's gone down by 9%.
Mr. The Minister's answer in relation to the former is absolutely right. But will he also accept that another variable, perhaps of greater practical concern, is the variation in the willingness of the health sector to work jointly with local authorities to maximise the integration of the funds? Local authorities are well used to joint working and democratic accountability. There is not, I'm afraid, often the same history in regard to CCGs and other health institutions. What will he do in future new government about that?
I have great respect for my honourable friend, who has considerable knowledge in this particular area. He is absolutely right. We need to make sure that health and social care works far more collegiately, and they work far harder to make sure that services are integrated. We're determined to do that at a national level, with this department working with the Department for Health, and that's what we expect to see delivered at a local level for local people.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister has recognised, the social care precept means that funding available for social care is increasingly dependent on a local authority's tax base. In 2017-18, the precept will generate £9 million in additional funding in Sheffield, compared with over £31 million for Surrey. Does the Minister think that's fair?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman, he should look at the allocations for the £4.5 billion of social care funding that is coming to local authorities directly from government. That absolutely takes into account the fact that certain places can raise far more in council tax and from the social care precept than areas like his own. It is reflected in that, and I wish that he'd recognise it.
Reza Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many care homes up and down the country are reliant on care workers from the EU. Estimates show around 100,000 workers. What meetings has the Secretary of State had with the care sector to reassure them that when Britain leaves the EU, care homes will be adequately staffed with appropriately trained care workers?
I can reassure the honourable lady, who makes a very important point, that my honourable friend in the Department for Health has met with those care providers. So has my right honourable friend met with care providers, as I have myself, because this is an extremely important situation. We must make sure that we have enough care workers going forward to support the most vulnerable people in our society.
McCartney. Question 13, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Northern Powerhouse is central to our plans for an economy that works for all. During these past few months, we have published the Northern Powerhouse strategy. We've launched the second Northern Powerhouse investment portfolio. We've allocated over £500 million of local growth investment, launched the £400 million Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, committed tens of millions to cultural investment in the North, and of course supported 17 enterprise zones across the North, which in turn is providing employment for 9,000 people.
Jason McCartney.
Mr. Speaker, with Regional Growth Fund money and LEP funding helping local businesses in my Colne Valley constituency achieve record levels of employment, will the Minister make sure that this Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund builds on that success and make sure we really power the powerhouse for many years to come?
Absolutely, and I pay tribute to my honourable friend for the work he does promoting the local economy. In total, the Leeds City region, which includes his area of course, has received £694 million million of government funding for local growth funds, and the new £400 million investment fund is there specifically to support small and medium-sized businesses across the north that want to grow and expand.
Really helpful. Mr. Ann. Chiomura.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The North East should be the powerhouse for our country's manufacturing and exporting renaissance, with a workforce that takes pride in building things. Why is it then that the so-called industrial strategy and the so-called Northern powerhouse does so little to invest in the jobs and infrastructure that the North East needs?
It's a slogan and nothing more.
Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons I think people in the north of England have lost their faith in the Labour Party is because they never have anything positive to say about the north of England. All they do is talk down the north, talk down people. Look at what's actually happening in the north east. £379 million of direct government investment in the north east, record unemployment. So she might not want to talk at Newcastle, but I will, because it is absolutely leading this country's economic recovery.
David Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on that note, Mr. Speaker, the Lancashire County Council have continually blocked an enterprise zone and business park in Morecambe and Lonsdale. Since the M6 Link Road has opened up, we've been crying out for it. The Secretary of State himself has come down to see it. Would the Minister like to come in the election and listen to the businesses who want this enterprise zone or business park?
Mr. Speaker, I would be delighted to take up that, and I plan to be visiting many constituencies across the north during this election period, and I will, of course, visit his. I know he's met with the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of State has already visited. The enterprise zones are making a real difference to the economy of the north, and as I've said, 9,000 jobs are now being provided on them, so I will certainly visit.
Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Manchester Evening News reported over the weekend the pressure from Conservative backbenchers to scrap HS2 to fund the Brexit bill. Can the Minister confirm that HS2 to Manchester will go ahead to time and to the budget that's been outlined?
Mr. Speaker, there has been no change to this government's policy on HS2, and I would just remind him also, in addition to that, there is £13 billion of other investment, and what we're going to be seeing over these next 2 years in the Transpennine line in particular will be new rail, new carriages, new services, a whole new passenger experience. That's going to be over £2 billion of investments in that important Transpennine route happening under this government, and of course we'll also see the Northern Rail franchise operating on an improvement basis, unlike on the no improvement basis when it was run by the Labour Party.
Andrew. Question 15, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it is essential that local plans start from an honest assessment of housing need in the area, and as we set out in our housing white paper, we will introduce a standardised approach to assessing housing need to ensure that's the case.
The honourable gentleman was seeking to group this question with number 16, that of the honourable member for Pendle. I'm right. Good. He wants to do so. He can. He will. He's doing it. Stuart Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The methodology used by Leeds City Council has brought about an excessive 70,000 housing target, which is threatening swathes of greenbelt and greenfield sites in my constituency. If the alternative method proves my community's suspicion that the target is excessive, can this override the current target and help save these important green lungs in my constituency?
Mr. Speaker, the methodology will reveal what the real level of housing need is in Leeds. There are local authorities across the country that choose to build more homes than are needed because they have an ambition to grow, and that is a legitimate debate to be had, but his constituents should be clear what the real level of need is. And I should also say to him that the Housing White Paper makes it clear that greenbelt land should only be released in exceptional circumstances where all other options for meeting housing need have been explored.
Mr. Speaker, Pendle has lots of brownfield sites and already has many homes which have been granted planning permission but not yet built because of a depressed property market leading to low demand. How can we ensure that low demand in areas like Pendle are better reflected in housing targets?
Mr. Speaker, that is exactly the purpose of the new methodology that we are planning to introduce, that the level of housing need that we plan for should reflect what the real market demand for housing need is in an area.
Desmond Swain.
Mr. Speaker, in the past year we've received representations from Park Home residents as well as members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Our call for evidence reviewing the legislation was published on the 12th of April, addressing key concerns including charges, site management and harassment.
Sir Desmond.
Will he remove the temptation which prompts those park owners that have neither the social nor managerial skills to make a success of it to maximise their sales revenue commission by bullying residents so as to secure a higher turnover of such residents.
Mr. Speaker, bullying and harassment is not acceptable in any form. That's why we introduced the Mobile Homes Act 2013, which gives local authorities greater powers. But we will obviously listen to the response to the call for evidence to see if further action is required to stop the kind of behaviour he describes.
Steve Double.
19, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, our white paper sets out measures to increase the use of modern methods of construction in house building. These measures offer a huge opportunity both to speed up how quickly homes are built and to improve the quality of the build.
Thank the Minister for that answer. Cornwall Council recently granted planning approval for the Garden Village at West Carclays in St Austell. The vision for this development is to have the highest quality of sustainable homes built using modern construction methods. Does the Minister agree with me that it is vital that the developers of this site are held to this vision, and what support can he give to ensure that this happens?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is an outstanding advocate for his community, and I would be very happy to meet with him to talk about how the government can assist, both in terms of the infrastructure required and the mix of housing as the proposed scheme goes through the planning process.
Mr. Peter Bone. Mr. Speaker, the Rushton Lakes development in my constituency is having modern construction methods. It's creating hundreds of jobs. There is an extension to this which has been approved unanimously by East Northamptonshire Council, which was submitted to the Secretary of State for approval on the 4th of April. The Council is concerned that because of the election this might not give enough time for it to be approved. What is the position relating to that?
Mr. Speaker, the government is now in purdah, so further decisions can't be taken, but this is obviously an issue that the new government can look at straight away. It is to my honourable friend's credit and his council's credit that they are one of the parts of the country that is determined to build the homes that we so desperately need.
Carl McCartney.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're supporting our high streets to thrive as consumer habits change. We've introduced the biggest ever cut in business rates worth £6.6 billion, launched the High Street Pledge and Digital High Streets Pilot in Gloucestershire, and we're also celebrating our high streets through the hugely successful Great British High Streets Awards, which members on all sides of this House supported.
Carl McCartney.
I thank the Minister for that answer. In Lincoln Sinsel Street, a much treasured traditional shopping area just off our high street, although full of first-class independent shops, they are all losing customers by the day due to large-scale regeneration works. I and many others believe the Valuation Office should reduce business rates for these shops directly affected during this period, and that their landlord, the Lincolnshire Co-op, should also discount their rent, especially as they have caused the shortfall. What does my honourable friend think the Valuation Office should do?
I'm sure it's just a matter of time, Mr. Speaker. Businesses are fully entitled to make a case, of course, for a temporary reduction in their rateable value. I do know Sinsel Street very well as a fellow Lincolnshire MP. What I would advise his businesses to do is to contact the local Valuation Office, Mr. Speaker, and to discuss with them whether the rateable values can be amended at all.
Dakin.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister is well aware, there has been a significant increase in begging on Scunthorpe High Street over the last 3 years, and the police, the local authority and the courts between them don't seem to be able to roll up the sleeves and sort this problem out despite trying very hard in many different ways. What's the government going to do to make sure the right powers are in the right place to tackle this issue?
Can I begin by congratulating my honourable friend on his marathon success yesterday? For such a young man, he did it in such a interesting time. But really, he deserves full credit for it. It is a problem I'm fully aware of course, in Scunthorpe, which is actually a town centre I think is on the way back. I'm happy to discuss with him further what we can do across government to try to help deal with that particular problem.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Traders in Cleethorpes High Street and elsewhere in the resort are particularly concerned at the moment following a decision by North East Lincolnshire Council, which of course is Labour controlled, to close a number of public toilets and refuse to repair others. It's having a very detrimental effect. I know that as the Coastal Communities Minister, he would want to look favourably on future requests for funding so that these amenities can be improved.
It's a delight to get a question from my other neighbour, and it is the case, of course, that across Lincolnshire, Northern Lincolnshire more generally, we've seen the council in North Lincolnshire actually opening new public toilets. We did recently allocate £20 million, Mr Speaker, to Northern Powerhouse projects through the Coastal Communities Fund. There will be a further round of bidding in October, and if the local Coastal Community team want to come forward with a proposal that includes that, we will, of course, look at it.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Question 22, Mr Speaker.
Bingo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Refuges provide vital support for victims of domestic abuse. Since 2014, we have invested over £33 million in services to support victims of domestic abuse, including refuges. We expect local areas to assess their need and provide services and support to meet that need.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have one refuge for women in my area, with 17% of specialist refuges in England being lost since 2010. What is the government doing to protect this vital lifeline for women and children?
This is an issue that this government takes extremely seriously. No person should be turned away from the support they need. In February, we announced that 76 projects across the country will receive a share of £20 million to support victims of domestic abuse, creating 2,200 extra bed spaces and giving support to over 19,000 victims. That includes additional funding to her own area of Lewisham.
Topical questions, Mr Andrew Turner.
Mr Speaker, in the past few weeks, we've set out our plans to crack down on rogue landlords, we've launched 12 new enterprise zones, we've unveiled a £40 million cash boost for Britain's coastal communities, and we've listened to some of the concerns voiced around the business rates revaluation and responded with a £435 million package. However, contrary to previous promises, I can no longer expect to deliver 100% business rates retention by the end of this Parliament. That's simply because the end of this Parliament will now be coming around rather sooner than I previously thought.
Andrew Turner.
Council welcomes the award of £9.5 million specifically for transport improvements. Another priority for the Council is to develop a back-office hub to improve services and save costs. What more can the government do to assist with that aim?
Mr Speaker, can I first tell my honourable friend I enjoyed my visit to his beautiful and sunny constituency last week, and I do think the idea of this back office hub that I heard from the local Conservative group is a very good one. And what it does, it highlights that Conservative councils cost you less but deliver you more. So if local people want to see this, indeed in the local elections throughout the country, they should vote Conservative on May the 4th.
Stephen Hepburn.
The Minister will know that since 2010, the Tories have stole 40% of South Tyneside Council's grant and 46% of Gateshead Council's grant. The victims of this crime are obviously the hard-working people in the area. Would the Minister like to take this opportunity to apologise to them for this shabby Conservative crime?
Well, the honourable gentleman raised an interesting question, as seen as his party stood on a manifesto at the last election where they said there would not be one more penny for local government. That said, as the honourable gentleman has heard, we're putting additional access to £9.25 billion, for example, for adult social care during the next 3 years, and his area will certainly benefit from that.
Kettering is a wonderful place to live, but some rural parts of the borough are blighted by inappropriate and illegal development by gypsies and travellers, and this is especially galling when many commuters in Kettering do far more travelling than so-called travellers ever do. If there were a planning policy for black people or a planning policy for white people, there would rightly be outrage in this country. Why do we have special planning provisions for gypsies and travellers?
Mr Speaker, can I first agree with my honourable friend that Kettering is indeed a wonderful place. I do understand that unauthorised encampments can cause real distress for local communities. And my honourable friend will know that since 2010, the government has made a number of changes that are designed to help with illegal and unauthorised encampments. But I do agree with him that more can be done, and I'd be more than happy to sit down with him and listen to what ideas he has.
Mr. Clive Betts.
The Secretary of State will be aware of the Select Committee's 2 reports into social care. Quite rightly, a lot of attention given to funding, but also to the state of the care workers who provide this important service. The committee heard that nearly half the workers leave within a year of getting a job, half are on zero-hour contracts. Many don't get paid travelling time in contradiction to the minimum wage legislation, and 27% don't get any training in dementia before they actually go out to deal with people with that condition. Isn't there a case now for developing a well-paid and well-trained workforce utilising Unison's ethical care charter as a basis for that?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Select Committee's work in this important area, and I will listen carefully to the final research that they come up with. And my honourable member will know that, first of all, more funding is helpful, and my honourable friend, the local government minister, referred to that earlier. But also there needs to be some longer-term changes that make the whole sector more sustainable, and that includes skills.
Cheryl Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased that parishes and town councils in my constituency are getting on with their neighbourhood plans. Does my right honourable friend agree that Cornwall Council must address these community-driven priorities to open up more options for local people who are facing difficulties in finding suitable housing?
Well, I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, to hear of the work that my honourable friend has been doing promoting neighbourhood planning in her constituency. She's a powerful champion for South East Cornwall, and she's absolutely right that Cornwall County Council needs to work with these neighbourhood plans to help local communities deliver the visions that they've set out.
Order, as I call the honourable member for Livingston, perhaps I may congratulate the honourable lady, as she is one of several members who magnificently ran the marathon yesterday and maybe feeling a tad tired today, but not too tired to stand up and ask her question. We're grateful to the honourable lady. Hannah Bardell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say I am eminently glad that I am on the order paper today and I don't have to bob, because I think that might just be beyond me. Mr. Speaker, the rise in hate crime following the UK's vote to leave the EU has shocked us all, and the rhetoric from this Tory government on immigration will do nothing to assist integration and cohesion. So what discussion has the UK Government had with ministers from the Scottish Government regarding the Casey report, and will he commit now to make sure that the policies in his party's manifesto will not seek to divide people along those lines?
Mr. Speaker, can I also first of all join you in congratulating the honourable lady on what she achieved yesterday, and all those people that raised so much money for so many good causes. The issue that the honourable lady raises is an important one. We are taking the Casey review very seriously. I think it shows the need for a new integration strategy to make sure that we do everything we can, working together across this House, including with people in Scotland and other parts of the UK, to make sure that we bring this nation together and reduce those people that face isolation.
Sir Nicholas Soame.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend confirm that he intends to increase the weight given to made neighbourhood plans, and will he indicate that the same weight will also be given to an emerging 5-year land supply?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to confirm the written ministerial statement, which is enlarged upon in the White Paper, is exactly designed to ensure that neighbourhood plans are not overruled when the local authority does not demonstrate a 5-year land supply. And I can also say to him that the White Paper contains proposals to help councils demonstrate that they have a 5-year land supply in order to uphold the plans that they've worked hard to produce.
Blomfield.
Mr. Speaker, Sheffield City Council is leading the way in building much-needed affordable housing through its innovative Sheffield Housing Company partnership. But across the country, the number of affordable homes built last year fell to the lowest in 24 years. Sheffield is doing its bit. Why is the government failing so badly to address the country's housing crisis?
Mr. Speaker, we are investing record amounts in affordable housing. Since 2010, we've seen 310,000 units, more than 310,000 units created throughout the country. And if he wants to know what a failure on affordable housing looks like, he need only look at the last Labour government, which saw a fall of 410,000 units in social housing for rent.
Desmond Sway. The Housing White Paper has greater expectations of local authorities. How is he going to keep them building?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Speaker, local authorities have a number of key roles: to produce a local plan that is based on an honest assessment of the level of need. Secondly, to then deliver that plan, and the new housing delivery test is key in that regard. But thirdly, if you look back when we did build enough homes in this country, local authorities played a crucial role building themselves. And we want to support local authorities doing that, either through their housing revenue account or through the local housing company model that the honourable gentleman opposite just referred to.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Speaker, surely the Secretary of State is aware of the damage being done to communities, local communities, by the cuts in local government spending, which has affected children's centres, their closure, cutting down youth services. They are at the very heart of our communities. What is he going to do to put that right?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will know that every council throughout the country has had to find efficiencies so that we can balance the books of our country and we can build a stronger economy. And some local authorities have done that well, mainly Conservative-led authorities, and Labour authorities have absolutely failed in that. So if people want to see more services being delivered for less, then they vote Conservative on May the 4th.
First glove.
Mr. Speaker, as the Secretary of State will know, thousands of new homes are being built across Northamptonshire. So what commitment can he give to local people in my constituency that across the board, infrastructure and public services will keep up with those new homes being built?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very important point about infrastructure and how having the right infrastructure can help people, local people, accept more housing. He'll know already local councils can put obligations on developers to deliver certain infrastructure. He'll know about the community infrastructure levy, which can also help. But I'd like to highlight the Housing Infrastructure Fund, the new £2.3 billion Housing Infrastructure Fund, which he can use locally in Corby, and he should make an application to my department to use that.
Mr. Speaker, despite a very strong objection from Historic England, who, like me, are concerned about the impact on the 12th century St John the Baptist Church in Adel, Labour councillors disgracefully voted for a controversial plan for 100 homes opposite. Will the Secretary of State not acknowledge that the planning system doesn't allow enough say for local communities to have a say against unwanted development?
Mr. Speaker, our planning system is built on a high level of community involvement at every stage. Local councils should work with communities in developing their local plan, and my honourable friend was just raising that issue in relation to Leeds City Council. But constituents also have the opportunity to make representations on planning applications and on appeals, and I'm sorry that in this case it appears that the City Council didn't listen to the concerns of his constituents.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Derby, we're looking at alternative methods of giving help to those people who are sleeping rough, such as an app which will direct funds to agencies like the Padley Centre that helps those people who are sleeping rough. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that initiatives like this can help tackle issues of rough sleeping?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend. It's our ambition, and I know my honourable friend shares this, to end rough sleeping in our country, and I think looking at this kind of, these kinds of new ideas can make a real difference.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
Following the successful and important meeting last week of the all-party leasehold and commonhold group about unfair and unreasonable abuses of leasehold, could my right honourable friend please say what plans the government has to do something about them?
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell my honourable friend, first of all, can I again commend him for the work that he's done in this area to highlight the abuses that have taken place. I am particularly concerned, and I know my honourable friend shares this concern, about where houses are sold on freehold. I think that this is an unacceptable practice, and we will do something about it.
Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Conservative group in Eastleigh has already questioned the methodology behind the need for an extra 10,000 homes, which could lead to a threatening of 400-year-old ancient woodland. Can the Minister outline how, without a local plan, when ancient woodland is under threat, housing numbers can be verified?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope that the Housing White Paper will help my honourable friend in two regards, and I know how passionate she is about protecting ancient woodland in her constituency. First, the new standard methodology will give a much clearer indication of what the real level of housing need in her area is. But secondly, we are proposing to increase the protections of ancient woodland. It's a precious resource we have inherited from previous generations which cannot be easily replaced, and it's right that we strengthen the protection.
Mr. Peter Heaton-Jones. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for the news that North Devon is to receive 2 coastal communities grants totalling more than £2 million. This was fantastic news. £500,000 for the museum in Barnstaple and £1.5 million for the new water sports centre in Ilfracombe, which I think the Minister is kindly coming to see soon. Would he join me in congratulating those in the community who helped to make this happen, and agree with me that North Devon only gets this sort of recognition when it has a Conservative MP and a Conservative government?
I am obviously going to agree with his latter point, Mr. Speaker, but I also want to pay tribute to him for the work he has done in advocating for both of those projects. The latest allocation of coastal community grants funded a whole host of projects across the South West, proving that if you want that investment to continue, then residents of the South West will have to vote Conservative in the forthcoming general election.
Robert Jenrick.
Will my right honourable friend the Secretary of State be Nottinghamshire's Robin Hood to Labour's King John and ensure that those parts of Nottinghamshire, including my Bassett Law constituents, are never forced against their will to join the Sheffield City mayoral region, and the historic county of Nottinghamshire and that of Derbyshire will be safe under a Conservative government?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is, of course, a matter for the Sheffield City region to determine who they consult with and what those proposals are. We obviously have to apply the statutory to test that, so I'm unable to say anything in detail on that, other than it is really important that residents in Bassett Law and in Derbyshire too make their views known as part of the consultation undertaken by the City region.
I'm happy to take 2 further questions if each of them consists of only 1 sentence. Fiona Bruce.
Thank the Secretary of State for his strong expression of concern regarding unfair leasehold titles which affect my Congleton constituency. Would he confirm that he's addressing this issue for those who've already bought, and for the future buyer, would he look at imposing requirements on the right to buy conditions so that they can only be bought under freehold or fair leasehold terms?
There are a few commas and semicolons in there. Secretary of State.
My honourable friend has done a great deal of work in this area. What I can confirm, and she'll know, is a particular problem in the North West that we are looking at all those issues very carefully.
Finally, Mark Halsey.
Would the Secretary of State consider a requirement on developers of large industrial sites to provide some units for smaller businesses to meet the shortage that currently exists in my constituency?
What I will point my honourable friend to is in our recent white paper, some of the changes we've talked about is making sure that the local plans take account of all needs, including the needs of businesses.
Order. Urgent question. Sue Hayman.
Thank you. You look like Robin Hood to me. Thank you. Thank you.
To ask the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs if she will make a statement on the publication date of the government's air quality strategy.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is committed to making sure ours is the first generation to leave the environment in a better state than we found it. As part of that, I'm deeply committed to the importance of ensuring clean air. And I can tell the House that since 2011, the government has announced over £2 billion to help bus operators upgrade their fleets, support the development and take-up of low-emission vehicles, reduce pollution from vehicles such as refuse trucks and fire engines, and to promote the development of clean alternative fuels. And then, in addition, in the autumn statement, we announced a further £290 million to support electric vehicles, low-emission buses and taxis, and alternative fuels. Our actions have enabled the UK to make significant progress on improving its air quality since 2010. We now have lower emissions of the 5 key pollutants: volatile organic compounds, sulphur dioxide, ammonia, particulates and nitrogen oxides. However, due to the failure of Euro vehicle emission standards to deliver the expected improvements in air quality, the UK is among 17 European countries, including France and Germany, who are not yet meeting EU emissions targets for nitrogen dioxide in parts of some of our towns and cities. We are taking strong action to remedy that. My department, since last November, has been working jointly with the Department for Transport to update the government's National Air Quality Plan for nitrogen dioxide. We've updated the analytical base for the plan to reflect new evidence following the VW scandal and the failure of the EU's regulatory regime to deliver the improvements expected on emissions. The plan adapts to these new circumstances by setting out a framework for action. So, following long-standing precedent, we have now entered the period of pre-election sensitivity that precedes elections. In accordance with the guidance covering both the local and general elections, the Propriety and Ethics team in Cabinet Office have told us that it would not be appropriate to launch the consultation and publish the air quality plan during this time. So the Government has therefore applied to the High Court for a short extension of the deadline to publishing the National Air Quality Plan for nitrogen dioxide, so that the Government can comply with pre-election propriety rules. So the Government is seeking to publish a draft plan by the 30th of June and a final plan by the 15th of September. The application will be considered by the Court. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, nearly 40 million people in Britain live in areas with illegal levels of air pollution. 2,000 schools and nurseries are close to roads with damaging levels of fumes, and NHS experts estimate that poor air quality contributes to 40,000 premature deaths every year. This situation has gone from bad to worse on this government's watch and has now escalated into what the EFRA committee calls a public health emergency. Does the Secretary of State agree that this is indeed a public health emergency? Given the gravity of the situation and the fact she's only known about today's High Court deadline for months, why did she choose to request a further delay to the publication on her air quality plan at 7 o'clock on Friday night? Will she clarify whether she had, in fact, already applied for an extension before the election was called? It is unacceptable to hide behind the election to delay publishing her plans. Cabinet Office rules are clear that purdah is not an excuse to delay acting on vital public health matters. Will she confirm that the plans are ready for publication? And if she agrees it is a public health emergency, why the delay? Isn't it the case that the government is doing everything it can to avoid scrutiny because it is missing its own commitments, has no strategy and wants to yet again kick this issue into the long grass? How can we trust her government to maintain air quality standards after we leave the EU when they've done everything possible to avoid scrutiny on existing standards and have had to be dragged through the courts? If the government fails to publish its plan today, then within the first 30 days of a Labour administration, we will. Only a Labour government will legislate for a new Clean Air Act, setting out how we would tackle air pollution that damages the lives of millions, while this Conservative government continues to shamefully shirk its legal responsibilities and puts the health of millions at risk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think right across this House we all agree that air quality is a significant concern, and I've already set out some of the strong action that this government has taken in spending £2 billion since 2011 to try to improve matters. It's exactly right. We do have our draft air quality plan for NO2 ready, and she asks, why do we have a late extension? I can absolutely explain to her that in the course of developing our draft plan, it was very clear that local authorities will have to play a central role in delivering the final air quality plan. So government initially sought to defer publication of the plan and the launch of the consultation on it until after the purdah period for local authority elections. Since that application was lodged, the Prime Minister called a general election and a further period of purdah commenced on the 21st of April. And as she will know, government normally seeks to avoid launching consultation exercises during purdah periods. It is absolutely vital that we get this done, and it is our intention that we will publish this on the 30th of June, which she says within 30 days with a Labour administration they would be publishing. That would actually be later than the intention of this government. I also want to make very clear that we now have entered a period of time where we are strongly advised not to be publishing consultations, and so what we are trying to do is a very short extension which we do not believe will make a difference to the implementation of our plans, but at the same time we are safeguarding our democracy.
Neil Parish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would urge the Secretary of State, along with all ministers, to work on this air quality plan at the very greatest urgency after the general election, because we have waited a very long time for this report. Much of the problems with diesels actually started under the last government, and so therefore we do need to clean that up. But a scrappage scheme not only for our diesel cars but also for buses, taxis and many other public transport in our inner cities is absolutely essential to clean up air quality, especially in our inner city.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, of course, my honourable friend is exactly right. We have been working on this plan now for several years. On this specific plan, we published a consultation in 2015 for clean air zones. It has been extremely difficult that the emissions of diesel vehicles far exceeded what was expected, and the EU regulatory regime did not show effectively what the real levels of emissions were. This government pushed for improvements to the assessment, and we have been planning for this draft air quality plan for a considerable length of time, and we will be publishing it just as soon as we can.
John McNally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the honourable member for securing this urgent question today on the government's air quality strategy, and I agree with her concerns entirely. Mr. Speaker, this is not a political issue. All our constituents need to be and to see an air quality plan based on good scientific evidence to ensure that people no longer have to breathe toxic air within their communities. The government have had 5 months, a 5-month window to address this illegal air quality strategy. Does the Secretary of State then agree with me that hiding behind a general election is not an excuse to fail to address this vital public health issue she's just mentioned? And the Minister said it is vital to get this legislation through. Why the delay?
Absolutely.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can only repeat that I absolutely agree with all members. This is a vital issue. We have spent the last 5 months looking very carefully at the real world as well as the laboratory tests for actual emissions to make sure that we get the right consultation. We do not expect that any delay due to propriety rules will lead to a delay in the implementation. We are seeking a very short delay to preserve our democracy in accordance with the guidance from Cabinet Office Propriety and Ethics Committee.
John Redwood.
Does she agree that there is rising concern, particularly about emissions that can damage health and lungs? And so would she make it a high priority to limit soot and smoke from public service vehicles where she has most influence?
Yes, my honourable friend is exactly right to raise that issue, and a huge amount of the investment that's already come forward from the government has been in looking at what we can do, for example, in retrofitting buses and taxis, and there are other measures such as limiting medium combustion plants, which I was very proud as an Energy Secretary to put into place to try to reduce the amount of other emissions. So my honourable friend is exactly right. There are a number of different areas of emissions that we need to tackle. This plan deals with NO2 emissions, and we will publish it as soon as we can.
On break.
Mr. Speaker, on the opposition benches, we'll monitor carefully whether the pre-election sensitivity applies equally to announcements or consultations the government welcome as ones which will cause the government embarrassment. But I must ask the Secretary of State, once the UK leaves the EU and the Commission are no longer able to levy fines on the UK government for failing to act with due speed on the premature deaths of 40,000 people a year caused by toxic air, who does the government expect will be levying fines, initiating cases against the government for air quality breaches?
Well, Well, I can agree with the honourable gentleman again that this is a very significant and serious issue, and I find it rather distasteful that he would suggest the only reason we might be motivated as a government to deal with it is because of the threat of EU fines. We absolutely intend to deal with the issues to make sure that the air is cleaner for the people of our country and to ensure that we are the generation that leaves our environment in a better state than we found it.
Mrs Cheryl Gillan.
Would my right honourable friend agree that it's not just people, but sensitive landscapes such as the nationally designated area of outstanding natural beauty, such as the Chilterns, Mr Speaker, that should not only be protected, but should be positively recognised for its role in the battle against poor air quality, including harnessing the potential of our trees and our ancient woodlands?
Well, I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend. She always speaks very strongly for the Chilterns, and she's right to do so. It's a beautiful area, and of course air quality is vital for humans, but so it is also for our lovely landscapes, and to preserve the contribution that our trees and peatlands and so on can make to that is a very important priority.
Dr Alan Whitehead.
My city of Southampton is one of the 10 cities that were threatened with infraction under the air quality regulations, and one of the 5 cities under the December government plans to introduce clean air zones. The local authority of Southampton has been really assiduous in moving forward with those plans, has put a great deal of its own city authority money, in addition to grant money that's been received, into forwarding those plans. Is it the advice of the Minister now that the City Council in Southampton should go easy on its plans because the government can't get its own plans together in the way that would bring those plans forward?
Well, I was in full agreement with the honourable gentleman until that last bit. Of course not. I was going to praise Southampton for the work that they've done. They've had significant, the council, they've had significant sums of government funding for their clean air programmes, and they are doing a good job, and they should continue to do that. And just to be clear, clean air zones can be implemented by any local authority as things stand. And so it should, of course, be in the interest of all local authorities to be looking at and doing whatever they can to improve the quality of air for their local communities.
Stuart Jackson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Isn't the air quality plan, hasn't it got to be seen within the wider context of the environment and tax changes? And isn't it the case that the government is in a more difficult position than it would otherwise be because of the legacy of the wrong-headed tax changes made by Labour when in power, which meant that we more than doubled the number of diesel cars and increased the number of diesel vans to 3 million as a result of their ridiculous tax changes under Gordon Brown?
Yes, well, I think my honourable friend makes a very good point, and it's interesting that, that in recent months several of Gordon Brown's and Tony Blair's advisers have come out and said that they were wrong to have encouraged the uptake of diesel vehicles as much as they did. And even the current shadow International Trade Secretary has admitted there's absolutely no there's absolutely no question that the decision we took on diesel was the wrong decision. So I do think that this government, as ever, is trying to clean up a mess that was started by Labour.
Alex Cunningham.
Emissions from industry are a major contributory factor to poor air quality, but major strides could be made to improve it in areas like Teesside if the government backed carbon capture and storage. We've been promised a Tory policy on this since they ditched funding 2 years ago. When will we get it?
Yeah, she doesn't know.
Well, as an energy minister of the past, I can absolutely tell him that we've always been clear that carbon capture and storage will play a part in our future plans, but that actually doesn't impact on the NO2 plan that we're talking about today.
Dr Sarah Wollaston.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State has clearly set out the reasons for the delay, but can I encourage her in the intervening time to strengthen our policies that will encourage people to get out of their cars altogether? And can I encourage her to look at the article in this week's British Medical Journal, which clearly sets out the evidence, the growing evidence, for the benefits of active commuting, particularly by bicycle, and to encourage us to get Britain cycling?
Yes, my honourable friend is exactly right to raise this. The government is a huge supporter of sustainable transport projects. We have invested £224 million in cycling since 2013 and also £600 million to deliver transport projects across 77 local authorities through the Local Sustainable Transport Fund. As she's right, we do need to do everything we can to protect the quality of our air in our cities, and that includes changing the way people travel.
Just as I congratulated the Honourable Lady the Member for Livingston, I'm delighted to congratulate the Honourable Gentleman Member for North Cornwall on his successful completion of the marathon yesterday. Despite that, he has sprung to his feet very impressively. Mr Scott Mann.
Much, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State and the Ministers at DEFRA will be well aware of the challenges facing Camelford in my constituency. They've recently had an air quality assessment and they're at the very early stages of having a Camelford bypass. So I would hope that the Secretary of State will support me and the local community in their bid for a new bypass in Camelford.
Well, I'd love to be able to offer him a new bypass. Unfortunately, that's outside of my powers to do that, but I do absolutely wish him luck with it and also congratulate him too for his amazing achievement yesterday.
Fiona McTaggart.
At the present rate, there will be 7 more dead people in Slough by the date that she publishes this air quality plan.
She's responsible.
The whole point of PERDA is that you shouldn't make announcements unless they are significant in terms of urgent health issues. Isn't this an urgent health issue? And what is she going to say to the families of those 7 people who will die before she even publishes?
Embarrassing yourself now, Fiona. Well, she's right to say poor air quality is a public health issue, and that's why we are taking urgent action, and we will ensure that a short delay to the timetable will not result in a delay in the implementation of the plan. By doing this, we'll tackle this public health issue as quickly as possible without prejudicing our democratic process. Now, safeguarding public health is one example of a possible exceptional circumstance to publishing consultations during PERDA, but this would generally only apply if there was an unexpected public health emergency, such as, for example, contaminated food, that needed to be dealt with instantly, so this doesn't fall within that category of exception.
Mr Andrew Salu.
Would the government confirm that it remains technology neutral as far as this, dealing with this issue is concerned, and that specifically as far as hydrogen is concerned, that the government will do what is necessary to make sure we don't fall behind countries like Germany and California in terms of cleaning up this terrible problem?
We're technology neutral.
Well, I can confirm that we are technology neutral, and it is a part of our industrial strategy that we're consulting on how to become a world leader in ultra-low emission vehicles of all types. So I think there's a very good story to tell there, more to be done, but we're making good progress.
Ruth Cadbury.
Mr Speaker, air quality standards are regularly breached in my constituency from Chiswick, Brentford, Isleworth and through to Hounslow. Do my constituents not deserve better on this issue, especially as the government wants to push ahead with runway 3 at Heathrow, which will only make the problem significantly worse?
Well said. Good one.
Well, I can say to the Honourable Lady that I met with the Mayor of London in my first week in office to discuss clean air, because she's exactly right. It's a huge priority in all of our cities, but particularly in London. I know there's a huge focus on it, quite rightly. But what I can say to her is that the Mayor is implementing the excellent work of my right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge, when he was the Mayor of London, and that continuity should continue to be a cross-party cooperation to solve what is a very serious issue for all of us.
Dr Andrew Murison.
Right honourable friends share my sadness at the lack of contrition displayed by the benches opposite, given that their unquestioned adoption of policy in the early part of the last decade resulted in a massive increase in the number of diesel vehicles, making the air in places like Westbury and my constituency considerably more toxic.
Yes, well, I completely agree with my honourable friend, and of course Now, there are a number of advisers and indeed serving members of the benches opposite who admit that their decision to promote diesel was not the right decision back in 2000 to 2008. And that is a great shame, because now, of course, we are trying to deal with some of the consequences of that. And so it's very important that cross-party we all cooperate with one another to try and make sure that we tackle what is a very significant issue.
Pennycook.
Speaker, air pollution contributes to the premature deaths of tens of thousands of people. We all know that. Yeah. Do I take from her previous answer that she thinks air pollution is only a public health issue and not categorically a public health emergency?
Well said. Well said.
I think that clean air is an absolute top priority for this government. As I say, we have been working on our new proposals for the last 5 months, and we are ready to go with our proposals. We are now seeking a very short deferral to meet the propriety rules around PERDA, and we don't expect that that will delay the implementation of our plans to deal with what is a very significant and urgent concern.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
Speaker, I wore an air quality monitor as part of the Environmental Audit Select Committee's inquiry into air emissions. This showed that the Mill Hill Broadway bus station had levels of pollution as high as Oxford Street. So this is a huge concern for my constituents. But does the Secretary of State share my concern that some directly elected mayors will use this as an opportunity to introduce congestion charges on motorists who were told to buy diesel vehicles, not use that money for air quality, and indeed, in addition, take money for addressing the same problem?
Well, what I can say to my honourable friend is that the Prime Minister has made very clear that this government is on the side of ordinary working families and businesses. And she has said we are very conscious of the fact that past governments have encouraged people to buy diesel cars, and we need to take that into account when we're looking at what we do in the future.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I, in the nicest possible way, put the Secretary of State right on this? She's had to be dragged to the House to make this statement. She has been putting off major decisions right across the future of her department and all those important issues. But can I put the record straight just on the fact my constituents won't understand where children are being poisoned now, where pregnant women are being poisoned now, pedestrians and cyclists are being poisoned, and she is bringing some obscure mention about PERDA to stop us doing something about it. Can I remind her that it's 2 years since we knew the Volkswagen scandal broke, and she has had 2 years and she's done nothing.
Nonsense, Barry. Well, in truth, what this government did was to lead the EU in sorting out the emissions calculations to make sure that they were accurate. So a few years ago, the EU's assessment and the VW cheating and the wrong-headed emissions assessment were just that. They were wrong. Subsequently, led by this government, we have pressed for better calculations and better assessments. We've been working extremely hard to get our plans ready, and this is a very short deferral to deal with propriety rules. We will be publishing our plan as soon as possible after the general election, and then we do not believe there will be any delay in implementation, which will be in the shortest time possible. It's a very important issue.
Sir Desmond Swain.
You will want to know, Mr. Speaker, that on Friday I launched the new double-decker fleet for the X3 service, which runs from Salisbury to Bournemouth via God's own towns of Ringwood and Fordingbridge, combining convenience and comfort with lower emissions than the lawnmower that I pushed round my garden on Saturday evening. If she wants to break the unrelieved tedium of the PERDA of which she has spoken over the next few weeks, can I recommend that she joins me breathing deeply the fresh air of the Avon Valley on the X3 service?
Always of interest to learn about the right honourable gentleman's domestic activities and to discover that, despite the receipt of his knighthood, to his great credit, the right honourable gentleman remains truly a man of the people. I'm sorry only that we don't have photographs of him pushing his lawnmower around, but I suspect it is only a matter of time. Secretary of State.
Yes. Well, I hope he has an electric lawnmower to go with his electric buses. But of course, he'll be aware that in the autumn statement, the Chancellor announced £150 million in support of low-emissions buses and taxis, including support for retrofitting buses and for boosting the UK retrofit industry. That wherever I go in the country, I will be able to breathe deeply and enjoy the non-fumes from new low-emission vehicles. Incredibly important, and it's this government that's taking action.
Mr Andrew Slaughter.
Speaker, the Secretary of State may have met the Mayor of London, but he is taking action on air quality while her government sits on its hands. Does she agree with Sadiq Khan that this is the biggest environmental crisis of our time? And if so, will the government review one of its worst environmental decisions, building a third runway at Heathrow?
Well said, Andrew.
So he's exactly wrong to say that this government hasn't taken action. I've given countless examples of where we are taking action. We've recently issued over £3.5 million of grants to particular councils for particular projects. This government is the one that is taking action, and as I've made clear, of all 5 major pollutants, we've seen reductions, significant reductions in recent years. In answer to his point about expanding at Heathrow, that will take place only provided the air quality can be ensured, and those plans haven't yet come forward. Well, those plans haven't yet come forward.
Charlie Elphicke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would the Secretary of State agree that pollution is a serious problem, but that for the Mayor of London to seek to demonise the drivers of diesel cars and indeed use pollution concerns as a smokescreen through which to seek to fleece motorists for more taxes is not the answer, particularly as Transport for London figures show that diesel cars are 10% of the problem. The Mayor should be dealing with 100% of the problem, not just 10%.
Well, he's exactly right that all councils that have air quality problems will need to deal with them and tackle them, dealing with 100% of the problem. And all I can reiterate is, as the Prime Minister said, a number of people were encouraged to buy diesel cars by the last Labour government, and we want to take their needs into account so that we don't end up penalising people for decisions they took in good faith.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Latest figures, Minister, show that new cars are failing to filter out polluted air. Indeed, air inside cars is up to 10 times more toxic than on footpaths. The ventilation of the cars isn't working correctly either. Minister, you have given us a timescale for when this process, the consultation process, will take place and the comeback. Can we have some idea whenever the legislation will come to this House for endorsement?
Well, the timetable that we have set out to account for PERDA is that we will publish our plans on the 30th of June, and then we will have a final plan by the 15th of September, and then legislation will come into place as soon as possible after that. But that work, the work that will need to be done to come into compliance with that plan, will be able to start straight away.
Carol Monaghan.
Good choice, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, electric vehicles will reduce emissions in our city centres, improving urban air quality. However, without support for renewables, any air quality plan is simply shifting pollution from urban to rural areas when these electric vehicles need to charge and therefore plug into the grid. So would the Secretary of State agree that renewables is key when we consider the future electric vehicles and should be included in any air quality plan?
Yeah.
Yes, well, I'm sure she would agree with me that this government has done more to support renewables than most others. So, we have a very good track record in boosting renewable electricity generation. I can certainly tell her that we want and expect to see the majority of recharging taking place at home at night after the peak in electricity demand. Home recharging should be supported by workplace recharging for commuters and fleets, with a targeted amount of public infrastructure where it will be most used. But I'm sure she'll also be delighted that in the 2016 autumn statement, the Chancellor announced a further £290 million to support electric vehicles, low-emission buses and taxis and alternative fuels.
Mr Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Glasgow is still, unfortunately, something of an air pollution hotspot, and Byres Road in my constituency and Hope Street in that of my honourable friend for Glasgow Central are both particularly affected. There is a city action plan, and we hope if and when the SNP take control of the city next week or the week after, they will bring a breath of fresh air to the issue. But will she also welcome the action of local campaign groups such as Action Hill Head and the Glasgow University Climate Action Society, in both raising awareness and encouraging people to take local action in their areas?
Yes, Mr Speaker, I'm always delighted to welcome the actions of local voluntary bodies to try and change the way people travel and to encourage the take-up of good, healthy cycling and all the rest of it. Why not walking as well when you can? But recognising that air quality is often the result of people needing to use their own vehicles, their own vans, etc. And of course he'll be aware that the actual policy on air quality is a devolved matter. So the plan that we have is a shared plan between all of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, so we will all be publishing that as soon as we can.
Thank you. Point of order. Yes. Point of order, Fiona McTaggart.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. You will be aware that I requested a question following the discovery at my advice surgery last Friday that the MP's hotline for the Home Office had been due to shut at 5 p.m. and not reopen until after the general election. I later discovered that this was the practice for a number of government hotlines. These are mechanisms which enable MPs, and as you know, we are members of Parliament until next Tuesday, enable them to get justice for their constituents. Following that request, my office got a telephone call from the Cabinet Office saying, please withdraw it. Oh, we don't really want to answer this. And I didn't accede to that request. And what seemed to thereafter happen was that a whole load of hotlines started reopening. So I quite understand why you didn't grant my request for an urgent question, because it seems to me just asking you had the result. But can I ask you for an assurance, as a champion of the backbencher, to make sure and use your best efforts to make sure that the original plans to cut off this service to members of Parliament to occur last week does not occur until after this Parliament is prorogued?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady. The Leader of the House is in his place, and notwithstanding the excoriating remarks that the honourable lady has made about the government, it may well be the wish of the Leader of the House to clarify the matter as he thinks fit. I can say only that I will always do my best for backbench members, and as the honourable lady has announced her intention to leave the House, perhaps I can wish her great good fortune, health and happiness in all that she goes on to do. I'm very conscious that she and I entered the House together 20 years ago, and we've come to know each other well over the last 2 decades, and as I say with feeling, best wishes and good luck. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, further to that point of order, it might be for the convenience of the House if I just clarify that the understanding I have from the Cabinet Office is that there were some technical problems with 1 or 2 lines at the end of last week, but it was never, and certainly is not, the intention of the Government that the PERDA rules should be applied at this stage. They will, of course, come into force, as is normal, at the dissolution of the House, when all members cease to have the position of being a Member of Parliament.
Point of order, Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And it's further to the honourable lady's point of order. My office this morning contacted UK Visa and Immigration only to be told we are in PERDA and they would not talk to them even with ongoing cases. There's clearly an inconsistency of advice going on, and I wonder maybe if the Leader of the House could respond to the further point of order.
The position is exactly as I have just said in response to the point made by the honourable lady, the member for Slough.
Well, I hope that will prove to be adequate in the coming days, and I'm most grateful to the Leader of the House for what he's just said, and I thank the honourable lady. If there are no further points of order, we shall now proceed to the business of the House motion for the 24th, 25th, 26th and 27th of April. The Minister or what to move? Minister to move? The Leader of the House to move.
Mr Speaker, I beg to move the motion that appears on the order paper in my name. The purpose of this motion is simply to allow for the orderly conclusion of the business currently before the House is prorogued. The provisions are being made for the convenience of the House so that we can bring proceedings on our business to a swift and orderly conclusion.
The question is the business of the House motion for the 24th, 25th, 26th and 27th of April as on the order paper. Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Leader of the House for bringing this to the House, and also for the helpful explanatory note, which actually runs to 3 pages, which is in the vote office, but also to thank the staff for the expeditious way in which they're dealing with the future business, given the forthcoming general election.
Order. I don't think there is any further... Well, there is a further would-be contributor. Indeed. Mrs Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would simply like to add to the remarks made by the Leader of the House and to thank him for bringing this urgent business to the House, and to rest assured that we will scrutinise everything as in our normal fashion.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Northern Ireland Ministerial Appointments and Regional Rates Bill, second reading.
Now.
Thank
you. To move the second reading of the bill, I call the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary James Brokenshire.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time. Before I move forward with this business, I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to those in the police service of Northern Ireland and other emergency services who spent yesterday keeping people safe from a significant bomb placed by dissident Republican terrorists next to a primary school in North Belfast. I am sickened by this incident, which has caused outrage in the community and far beyond. It is clear that the consequences could have been utterly devastating, potentially to put children, the wider community and police officers in danger. Shows a wanton disregard for life. This shows these terrorists for who and what they really are, and is a potent reminder that they have nothing to offer. I will give way.
Would he also accept that attempts by the BBC this morning to try and somehow justify what the terrorists did at the weekend on the basis that there had been no political progress shows the kind of banal reporting that we get from the BBC and is not worthy of a body which is funded from public funds?
Well, the honourable gentleman has made his point in his own way, and all I would say is that this was an appalling incident for which there is no justification whatsoever. And again, I think the whole House would wish to pay tribute to the PSNI and all of those agencies who do such an incredible job in seeking to provide security for Northern Ireland, the risks that they often put themselves under as a consequence of that, and the incredible contribution that they make. Very briefly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that it is not enough for political parties and individuals to say they support the rule of law? It is surely incumbent upon all of us to support the individual officers who come from right across the community to serve all of the community, and that we all of us should be giving them wholehearted support.
The right honourable gentleman, I think, has made a very powerful and important point about the incredible job that the PSNI do, the contribution that they make and what that means for them in many cases. I have a huge amount of respect at their professionalism, but just that personal dedication that they bring. And I'm sure the whole House would wish to underline that message of support to the incredible job that they do. Moving to the bill before the House, Mr Speaker, I have updated the House twice on the political situation in Northern Ireland in recent weeks, in my oral statement on the 28th of March and in my written ministerial statement of last week. On occasions, I set out what I would seek to bring forward, that I would seek to bring forward legislation with two aims in mind: to provide the legal basis for an executive to form and to set a regional rate to enable that important source of revenue to be collected. As we approach this final week of this Parliament, I believe that now is the right time to deal with both of these matters, to provide greater certainty for the people of Northern Ireland and to provide the opportunity for the parties to come together to secure the resumption of devolved government. The background leading up to the bill today will be familiar to many in this House, Mr Speaker. The collapse of the previous executive in January placed a duty on me to set a date for a further election. I did so in January, with the election itself held on the 2nd of March. Since then, the UK Government has been engaged in talks with the political parties and, as appropriate, the Irish Government, in accordance with the well-established three-stranded approach. These talks have had one clear purpose: to re-establish an inclusive devolved administration in line with the 1998 Belfast Agreement and its successors. Progress was made on several fronts during that phase on the formation of an executive, including the budget and programme for government. There was progress too in terms of legacy. Constructive discussions took place with all the parties on the detail of the legacy institutions set out in the Stormont House Agreement and on the need to reform legacy inquests. While no one will underestimate the challenge in addressing the legacy of the past, I do believe that the proposals are now sufficiently developed that the next step should be to publish proposals for consultation. That way we can listen to the views of victims and survivors and all those that will be most affected by the proposed new institutions. However, despite the progress that was made, there remains a defined number of outstanding issues where there is a lack of agreement between the parties, and it was clear that a period of reflection was necessary to give the impetus for discussions to conclude positively. It was with that in mind that talks were paused over Easter, and since then meetings have continued between the parties. The restoration of devolved government remains achievable and remains the absolute priority. This will require, though, more time and more focused engagement by the parties on the critical issues that remain, building on the discussions over the course of the past 7 weeks. The bill before this House today would provide the space and the opportunities for the parties to do just that. We will remove the present legal barriers so that the Assembly can meet and an executive can be formed at any point from royal assent to the 29th of June, 3 weeks after the general election. We recognise that there will be focus on the general election. That is why the bill provides parties with the scope and space to continue discussions to resolve their outstanding issues, while providing a period of reflection for the new government if a deal still does not prove possible. That said, it remains highly desirable for the parties to continue to work to make progress quickly for the reasons I've set out, and this bill does not preclude the formation of an executive sooner if the parties wish for that to happen. That, Mr Speaker, is an important point. In passing this bill, we make clear that the responsibility lies with the parties to come together and make progress. And as I have indicated, I strongly believe that that can still happen. We have removed the legal barrier to progress, enabling an executive to form without the need for a further Assembly election. If the parties have the will to make progress between now and the end of June, therefore, the platform is in place for them to do just that. And we should not lose sight of the benefits and of an agreement in the meantime would have for the people of Northern Ireland. I'm sure that will be the hope of those voters who gave the parties a mandate on the 2nd of March. I would like to pay tribute to the opposition for their constructive, positive engagement during the process leading up to the introduction of this bill. And in that regard, I would like to pay particular tribute to the Honourable Member for Blaydon, who may be making his final appearance at the dispatch box as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Despite our broader political differences, I would like to thank him for the overall support he and his party have given to me since I became Secretary of State last July. Northern Ireland undoubtedly benefits from the broadly bipartisan approach we take in this House, and whatever the result of the general election, I hope that that will always continue. I do wish the honourable member all the very, very best for the future. His presence will be missed, I know, by many across this House who will wish him well in whatever new opportunities and new challenges he takes forward. Moving to the substance of the bill, as I've indicated, Clause 1 would remove the present legal barrier to an executive being able to form to enable any deal reached to be implemented. It would retrospectively reset the 14-day clock in the Northern Ireland Act of 1998, which had expired on the 27th of March, with a 108-day period, removing the present duty on me to set a date for an election, with it arising again at 4 p.m. on the 29th of June if an executive had not been formed by that point. This will provide the space for an executive to form, making clear that the responsibility lies with the parties, indeed that duty to form an executive and appoint ministers in that process. As necessary, it would provide a period for further talks in the new Parliament, allowing all sides to take stock and move forward if a deal was not already in place. And it would also mean that if a deal is not struck, there is a period for the new government to properly consider the way forward. That's important, Mr. Speaker, for in the absence of a deal, there will be significant decisions to be made in the new Parliament to provide political stability in Northern Ireland. However, it will be for the parties to seize the opportunity, whether in the coming weeks or soon after, to deliver the executive that they have so clear a mandate to secure. I mentioned previously the two acute issues of financial uncertainty caused by the lack of an executive. The first is the absence of a 2017-18 regional rate, which represents more than 5% of the total revenue available to the Northern Ireland Executive. Normally, this would have been set by the Department of Finance earlier this year via an affirmative rates order in the Assembly. This would have enabled bills to be issued in 10 instalments, giving certainty to ratepayers and allowing various payment reliefs to be applied. Time has nearly run out, however, for that course. If no rate is set in the next few days, there will be fewer bills in higher instalments. And the longer it takes to set a rate, the worse that situation would become. The only outcome, Mr. Speaker, would be bad debt, lost revenue, uncertainty and hardship. So, while we are clear that this is a devolved matter, we are also clear that only the UK Government can take action to secure the interests of individual businesses and indeed the Executive itself. Clause 2 of this bill would address this issue by setting a 2017-18 regional rate in Northern Ireland. It does so by setting pence per pound rates for both domestic and non-domestic properties. These rates represent a 1.6% inflationary increase, the same approach as were taken by the Executive in setting a rate the year before. As we make clear in clauses 2, 4 and 5, it would not cut across the continuing right of the Executive to set a rate by order in the usual way. So this would be the most limited step available to us, taken at a point beyond which we cannot delay. I will give way.
Thank you, Secretary of State, for giving way. The Secretary of State is very well outlining the business that this House may have to do and the business that he has to do today. But does he accept that we should not be in this place because of the arrogancy of Sinn Féin, who walked away from the Executive and has left Northern Ireland in the predicament that we are today?
What I can say to the honourable gentleman is that in the recent election, I think that a clear mandate has been set to see the resumption of a devolved government in Northern Ireland, an inclusive devolved government, and that is where I think the focus needs to lie, on getting that Executive back into position, dealing with, yes, differences that do exist between the parties in Northern Ireland, but I think the responsibility that we all should feel in actually seeing an executive back into position, working and serving the best interests and the needs of people in Northern Ireland, because ultimately that, I think, is where our absolute and resolute attention should lie. And for completeness, although not covered in the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, the second financial matter is the lack of a 2017-18 budget itself. Its absence has meant that since the beginning of this month, civil servants alone have been in charge of allocating cash, which is clearly not an acceptable solution for the longer term. Before Easter, therefore, I made clear that I would provide further assurance in this regard if an executive was not in place, consistent with the UK Government's ultimate responsibility for political stability in Northern Ireland. So I wish to take this opportunity to provide further clarity to people, businesses and public services in Northern Ireland. We very much hope, as I've said, that we will see an executive up and running as soon as possible. But if that does not prove possible, I want to put on record that this government would be prepared, as a last resort, to pass an Appropriation Act in the next session to provide legislative authority for the expenditure of Northern Ireland departments. This is not a step any government would take lightly, but this House must not forget the duties we must uphold for the people of Northern Ireland. I will give way.
And he has identified a very important issue, the lack of budget. But would he accept that even with the assurances he has given the House today, there are still tens of thousands of people within the voluntary and community sector who depend upon money from government departments, money which they cannot be assured of at this stage, and therefore they find that their jobs currently are in jeopardy and they are faced with uncertainty. And the longer he leaves this decision, the more he leaves the people in that particular sector of the economy in a vulnerable position. That's right.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman makes a very important point about the voluntary community sector in Northern Ireland, and in coming forward with the written ministerial statement that I have and in what I have said this afternoon, I very much had them at the forefront of my mind, knowing that some people have been put on protective notice, the impact of uncertainty around whether payments will be continued beyond the current window. I know that assurance has already been given by the civil service and departments around funding for 3 months, but what further assurance can be given? And therefore, by providing comfort to permanent secretaries through the written ministerial statement that I have made, I am advised that government departments will be able to extend current letters of comfort to actually give that greater support, give that greater flexibility for the voluntary and community sector. But his broader point that he makes about the need for greater certainty, the need for a budget to be put into position, is absolutely right. This is not a situation that can continue for much longer, and therefore why I have said what I have about the preparedness of this government, if re-elected, to make steps to be able to seek an appropriations bill in this House, should that prove necessary. But as I've already indicated, I hope, earnestly hope, that it will not prove necessary, and that an executive can and will be formed to actually make those decisions. And in making the statement that I have today, that in no way cuts across the ability for an executive itself to come into position and to set a budget in due course. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the key points in running the budgets is the flexibility in running those budgets. We know that the civil servants will run their departments well with their budgets, but those little bits of flexibility that match when we're being rung as politicians and asked to help people. How does the Secretary of State see it in the future if we haven't got a functioning assembly, of how they're going to have some mechanism so that the people on the ground who have lost money or can't do something can actually be listened to?
Well, I think the clearest way of for an executive to be formed. And obviously that is the most direct way for assurances to be given and for direction to be provided. And that lack of political direction at the moment is one of those key aspects that underpins the need to see an executive, the need to see political decision-making being made in Northern Ireland at the earliest opportunity. But as I have indicated to the House this afternoon, it is also that preparedness of the UK Government to take action should that be necessary. And it is that sense of the responsibility that we have as the UK Government to provide the necessary political stability and assurance for the best interests of the people of Northern Ireland. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Secretary of State, for giving way. To be absolutely clear about this, is the Secretary of State stating to the House today from the dispatch box that the choice is very clear. It is devolution or direct rule. And by putting in place the points that he has made about appropriations, the groundwork is being laid for direct rule if that is required.
I don't want in any way to prejudge the outcome of the coming weeks. I earnestly hope and believe and want to see devolved government re-established in Northern Ireland. That is what is profoundly in the best interests of Northern Ireland, seeing that local decision-making. And I think the strong message should come across this House of wanting to see that into position at the earliest possible opportunity. I have been careful in what I have said in laying a position in relation to the budget, giving assurance today to allow the flexibility for the Northern Ireland Civil Service to use the residual emergency powers that they have to be able to deal with the pressures that they are already experiencing, and to be able to ensure that public services can continue to be run in the manner that they are. Because I have published a written ministerial statement which sets out indicative departmental allocations which reflect the budget priorities and decisions of the last executive. And these provide a basis for allocations in the absence of an executive. And I think it's important for me to make that point, that those numbers are not UK Government numbers, but rather reflecting the advice of the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service as to his assessment of a position which takes account of the priorities of the political parties prior to the dissolution of the Assembly, as well as further applications he considers are required. And they are intended to give clarity to Northern Ireland departments as to the basis on which they may wish to plan and prepare for more detailed decisions and to discharge their responsibilities in the meantime. However, we should be clear that these totals would not constrain the future freedom of an incoming executive to amend spending allocations, nor the UK Government in situations that it might need to reflect upon in terms of the final allocations in the light of circumstances at the appropriate time. But I do underline the position that the bill sets out, that if agreement is not reached by the 29th of June, that in essence the electoral duty would then come back onto the Secretary of State in terms of calling an election within a reasonable period of time. But obviously any incoming government would need to reflect very, very carefully on the stability and the position in Northern Ireland, and as I've indicated, what might be a need to deal with certain financial issues. But we need to be focused, we need to be resolutely focused on seeing that an executive into position, and that is precisely what this bill will allow for.
I will give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. But could I ask my right honourable friend if he's seen the indication from Sinn Féin that they might consider being part of an executive in the very detailed and long negotiations he's no doubt had so far?
Yes, I have. And that's why I believe that agreement is possible. I believe that the discussions that have taken place over recent weeks have shown where the space for agreement may lie, where the space for compromise may lie. And that is why it is important that this bill provides that space, it provides that opportunity for the parties to be able to find resolution of the outstanding issues and get back into devolved government, which is what the people of Northern Ireland voted for. To go back to the point on the budget does not allocate, for example, to be clear, the resource and capital funding provided in the Chancellor's March budget. This funding was not allocated before the dissolution of the last executive, and we believe it is right that funding is available for parties to allocate to further priorities as they deem appropriate. Further detail on these spending plans will need to be provided through the Appropriation Act itself. My hope and belief is the Act will be one taken through the Northern Ireland Assembly, but obviously that is something that relies upon that executive being formed and, as I've indicated, where the focus should lie. But if not, as I've said, we would be prepared to legislate to provide certainty in line with our ultimate responsibility for political stability and good governance in Northern Ireland. Of course, I will give way.
Can the Secretary of State clarify whether such legislation in that context would, in his mind, amount to direct rule in the sense that we have always known it, or would it be some form of downloadable legislative cover for administrative governance when it comes to further budget setting?
Well, again, I wouldn't want to prejudge what the situation might be. That will be for an incoming government. But my point remains that that does not need to be the outcome. The outcome that we want to see is an executive being formed. The outcome that we want to see is devolved government being put into place, making decisions within Northern Ireland for the people of Northern Ireland. And that is why I make the points that I do in terms of what this bill provides, how it does give the space to allow that to happen. And that must be the focus of all of us in the time ahead. And I believe that by passing this bill, we can provide the scope and space for a deal to be done by the parties. And I will be working intensively with the parties to ensure that outcome in the weeks ahead. Northern Ireland needs to see the restoration of an inclusive, devolved government working in Northern Ireland's best interests. That is what the people of Northern Ireland voted for. That is what will deliver the public services that people rely upon. That is what businesses, community groups and individuals across Northern Ireland want to see. The bill will secure a framework within which that can be delivered, and I commend this bill to the House.
The question is, the bill be now read a second time. Mr David Anderson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and to my comrade. Can I start by agreeing totally with the opening words from the Secretary of State about what happened yesterday in Ireland? It clearly is not where we need to be, and it's one of the reasons, probably the main reason, why we need to get this resolution and get the executive back up and running again. Can I also thank him very, very kindly for the words he said about me and the role I've tried to play in this House, and I would congratulate him on the work he's done and shared with me over the past difficult times to try and find a way forward. This is a debate I never wanted to have and I want to partake in, because the reality is this is a combined political failure on behalf of all the politicians right across these islands. The failure to constantly shape the crucial progress of confidence and trust has led to the sad situation facing us here today. Not many years ago, the world looked on with a mixture of amazement and admiration when people and politicians put to one side centuries of animosity and hatred to build a new future for the people they serve, and today we risk losing that vision. Madam Deputy Speaker, as this bill comes forward before the House, I'm mindful of the issues that have caused the current impasse that have brought us here today. Northern Ireland has seen drastic changes over the past few decades, and difficult challenges have been overcome, and the current challenges should not be by any means insurmountable. These are clearly less serious matters than faced us in 1998 or in 2007, but the repercussions of failure are equally as serious and dangerous. I believe with goodwill on all sides, agreement could be reached, but people will have to compromise. There are a number of areas I wish to highlight. First one, which is one of the sticking points being brought forward, is about equalities. And I would say to the honourable member who raised the issue before about the intransigence of Sinn Féin, none of us are surprised if Sinn Féin act in an intransigent manner. What has surprised me about the position we find ourselves now in how strong these feelings about the break-up of the present executive go right across the nationalist community. It isn't just one political party who has these real concerns. And one of those huge concerns is the failure to move on equality legislation. The Democratic Unionist Party is proudly a party of unionism, and yet they seek to limit the equality rights to people in Northern Ireland, the access to abortion and the rights of members of the LGBT community that is seen every other part of the United Kingdom. Why do they oppose this being extended throughout the entirety of our United Kingdom? Why should two people who love each other not be able to show that in a formal marriage ceremony in Northern Ireland as they can in the rest of Great Britain? And why should a woman in Northern Ireland not have the right to choose what she does with her own body? Show these ideas of equality and fairness are as core to their identity as there is to the identity of myself and every other person living on these islands. Another sticking point, which again we hope we can see progress on, is the issue around the Irish language. Again, it's another example of how rights that are enjoyed by other people across Great Britain are not available in Northern Ireland. And this is seen because of the fact that in Wales and in Scotland there is legislation that provides protections for their respective indigenous languages. And even in Cornwall, will do, there's council-backed Cornish language strategy. Why does some in the Unionist community want to deprive many in Northern Ireland of these same advantages? They'd like to give to Weir.
I think that maybe before the shadow spokesman pontificates on these issues, he should at least try and get his facts right. In Northern Ireland, £171 million has already been spent on giving the Irish language community the ability to have their own schools. Some schools have been opened with less than 14 children in them, to have street names if they wish to have them written in Irish language, to have letter headings in departments in Irish language, and a whole range of other kinds of issues addressed. So if he's going to talk about the promotion of the Irish language, at least get his facts right before he starts pontificating.
I'm more than happy to leave other people to pontificate. I've got much more practice of that than I have. But what I'll say quite clearly is this. The point I'm making is there's a difference in the protections in Northern Ireland, and that's what's being asked for by the nationalist community. They do not have the same legislative basis as they do in Wales and Scotland. And that is one of the things that politicians in Northern Ireland, tomorrow, they could have put it right over the last 10 years. They could have put it right since the talks broke down in January. They've chosen so far not to. I will indeed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Secretary of State is going through a list of the Sinn Féin demands. That's right. Yeah. And I just wish he would come and talk to us from time to time, because we have issues. And one of the issues is the Armed Forces Covenant, which is implemented in full in every other part of the United Kingdom except for Northern Ireland. So will the Shadow Secretary of State now join us in demanding that Sinn Féin honour that obligation and agree to fully implement the Armed Forces Covenant in Northern Ireland?
The honourable gentleman, for whom I have a lot of respect, says about and promoting what Sinn Féin is saying. I made it very, very clearly. These are the issues that have led to the impasse. They're not just Sinn Féin issues, and it's for this House and the people outside and the rest of Great Britain who might not have the inside knowledge that the member has, that I'm raising these issues here, to try and identify where the problems are and try and point out you can negotiate your way out of these if you want to. On the point of talking to his party, I met with his leader last week on these very issues, and I was very, very pleased to see that she's prepared to have discussions across the board. So, you know, in that example, we are trying to work as the way we always have, in a non-partisan way. I will indeed. Sorry, yes. On the Covenant, I'm pleased to say my honourable friend, the chairman of the Northern Ireland Select Committee, we worked together on the Armed Forces Covenant. We produced a report which we agreed that called on all parties to do the right thing by the people who served our country. So I don't need to take any lectures on the Armed Forces Covenant from the member behind me. I welcome these discussions that parties have been having, and I believe we can reach agreement, an agreement that is beneficial to the Irish language community, but also to the point that's been raised with me by his leader in Northern Ireland, that what they want is more support for the needs and the respect and the heritage of the Ulster Scots community. I believe that could be negotiated if people were serious about trying to find a way forward. And I understand that some of the reason why some of the parties in Northern Ireland are against legislating for an act. It's because it was seen as a side deal that was done by Tony Blair many years ago. Now, that might have been right or wrong at the time. It moved things on. I'm saying now it's another thing that could be done today, a relatively small step in the right direction to try and resolve the issues that are outstanding. I will give way.
Honourable Member for Giving Way. Does he honestly believe that any of the things that he has read out today from the dispatch box have actually led to the breakdown of the Assembly? Does he really in his heart believe any of that? And if he does, he's really saying to this House that he does not believe in devolution, because no region of the United Kingdom should have its differences recognised. Devolution has allowed for that, and on the basis of devolution allowing for that difference, the Honourable Member says no, everything should just be the same in the United Kingdom.
As somebody who's a really passionate supporter of devolution for many years, I do not take that criticism. What I will say, I believe that we've got a situation here that's at breaking point, and we need to find a way forward. I've spent all my life in negotiating situations, in conflict resolution, as a trade union representative before I came in this House. And what the truth is, we've got a situation that should be resolvable, but as long as people are saying we're not prepared to move on this or that or the other, and I mean on both sides, I'm going to come on to other things later in the speech, unless people are prepared to move, we'll end up with the reality that this House will probably have to take back direct control of what's in Northern Ireland, and that would be in nobody's interest. It wouldn't be in the interest of devolution, it wouldn't be in the interest of people governing themselves. I want to now move on to the situation of legacy. Clearly, one of the biggest issues facing all of us, and has been for many, many years, about how we deal with Northern Ireland's tragic past. The truth is, we've all of us, collectively feel the victims of the Troubles. It only serves to compound their ongoing suffering through our lack of action. And regardless of the background, or if they served in uniform, we depriving them and their families the truth and the closure that many of them want. The truth, regardless of how hard it is, must be heard. Throughout my many visits to Northern Ireland, I've heard details of many different cases from families who have lost loved ones. But one in particular stayed with me, the case of Samuel Devaney. I met with his family last year, and I was informed of them about the details surrounding his death in 1969. I'd like the House to bear in mind that date, almost 50 years ago. That family have never had access to the relevant files, files which are now held by the Metropolitan Police, and they were due to be released to the National Archives, but yet again they've been reclassified, and they've been retained by the police service until at least 2022. That cannot be anything other than a travesty. Think about 1969. It was a very, very different world. I was a 15-year-old boy starting work as a coal miner. England had just won the World Cup a couple of years before. We hadn't joined the common market. We were 2 years away. I thought that would get a cheer. We were 2 years away from decimalisation. Perhaps that's the next campaign we can run. The Beatles were still friends with each other. Brian Jones was still in the Rolling Stones. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison was still alive and making great music. It was a different... Yes, Labour was in office indeed, they were, and doing great things. But during that time, on the 19th of April, Mr Devaney died at the hands of officers from the RUC who were never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. Mr Devaney was seen as being one of the first victims of the Troubles, and still today his family are pleading for justice. Just a minute. This is just one of the many cases in Northern Ireland. The lack of progress from countless governments, both Labour and Conservatives, is a dereliction of duty from us here in Westminster. I'm not making a special case, Mr Devaney, other than the fact of how long it's gone on without closure for his family. It's completely and utterly unacceptable. Gentleman there.
The honourable member for Blaydon is making a very powerful speech that seems to include every sin that's ever been committed by every person in Northern Ireland. Would he not accept that perhaps today, as this Parliament comes to a close, and there is a clear financial imperative to see that the Northern Ireland government is able to continue, certainly through the period of our election, when the Minister will be somewhat constrained, and certainly through the period of the Northern Ireland Assembly's dissolution, when again the government will be constrained? Would it not be a little bit more helpful, perhaps, to look positively on how he can assist the Secretary of State, who has made a statesman-like speech, helping to bring people together rather than a divisive one, which is more in tune with his party's leadership than with his own spirit?
Perhaps it's my accent, perhaps the members isn't getting what I'm saying. What I'm telling you is, these are the realities on the ground. It's right and proper that this House hears what the obstacles are. Myself and the Secretary of State have talked about these ad infinitum over the last months to try and find and play our part in resolving them, of trying to say it to the people over there, these are issues, but they're not huge issues. This is not people being let out of jail as they were 20 years ago. This is not people being given on the runs. This is not people being pardoned. These are relatively small issues, but the genuine ones. If we can't resolve the issue of equalities, if we can't resolve the issue of legacy, then what are we here for? These will never... And he talks about the Northern Ireland government. I remind him, the Northern Ireland government isn't sitting. And I'm very, very clear. We will be supporting without a doubt. I've also had discussions with the head of the civil service, and I'm determined that they're allowed to have the powers that they need to carry on supporting the public service in Northern Ireland. So I'm a huge supporter of them. That's one of the reasons why I'm involved in this work at this moment in time.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman, but given the fact we are trying to achieve some consensus here and talk about these things in a very serious way, he would no doubt wish to reflect on citing examples of one side, with an acknowledgement there are still many, many families in Northern Ireland who have never had a proper inquiry or indeed an explanation from Sinn Féin or the IRA as to what happened to their loved ones. I think it's only fair that he should now reflect on that and perhaps say something about that too.
Thank you, Honourable Member. If I hadn't been so generous and kept on accepting intervention, I'm happy to do, I would come on to that point clearly. And I did make the point, I only used the case of the gentleman I raised because of how long ago it was. And if we can't resolve matters, just as genuine, reasonable human beings, forget what we are as politicians, what our party affiliation is, if we can't say that it's not right that 48 years since something happened, the families should not have the chance of saying, look, a report's being done, and here's the reason behind it. I'll go with the honourable lady.
I'm very grateful indeed to the honourable gentleman for giving way and taking an intervention. I'm sorry I wasn't here for the opening remarks, but I was here in time to hear the honourable gentleman's remarks about Mr Devaney and also the mention of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. My late husband was very, very proud indeed of the extraordinary men and the extraordinary women who served with extraordinary courage and made an extraordinary sacrifice. 302 murdered RUC officers. I wonder would the honourable gentleman just like to put on record his thanks and his gratitude and admiration for the RUC and the service that they gave during the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
I fully will do that, and I fully intend to do it anyway within speech. I'm prepared, as the honourable lady I think should confirm the work we've done together. Although we might have a different view on what the future of Ireland has done, we have worked together and recognised the great role that people have played. And in raising these issues about legacy, it's as much about getting the truth out for the people who might have been unjustly castigated for something that was not their fault, and they've been for years thrown wrong. But if we don't have clarity and we don't have truth and honesty, then we'll never get there. We'll give way.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Can I help him with an example? And following on from the comments of the honourable member for North Down. My cousin, Samuel Donaldson, was murdered by the Provisional IRA on the 12th of August 1970 with his colleague, Constable Roy Miller. They were the first two RUC officers to be murdered by the Provisional IRA in what has become known as the Troubles. No one has ever been brought to justice for their killings. The IRA, Sinn Féin have refused to cooperate in providing the information that would enable those responsible to be brought to justice. And I just would call upon the Shadow Secretary of State to join us in calling for Sinn Féin to step forward to the plate and to own up and to come clean and to give the information to families who've been waiting for decades for truth and justice.
I could not agree more with the honourable gentleman. I actually believe that is part and parcel of the demands we should be making from this House as part of their responsibility as democratically elected politicians. They should be doing that in every way they can. I've never ever run away from that. I want to make it clear, all victims to make it equal. Anyone who's been injured or killed as a result of trouble in Northern Ireland, whether civilians, paramilitaries, were one of the selfless individuals who sought to protect the people of Northern Ireland, those in the armed forces and those in the RUC, they all deserve the truth, and I call on all parties to do all they can to make that truth known. Indeed.
Secretary for giving way. He mentions the contribution of our armed forces in Northern Ireland. As a former soldier, I wonder if he might join me in confirming his belief that the British Army should not be subject to further investigations for the actions that they took during the Troubles. And will he confirm that his party, under its current leadership, that they have their loyalty firmly with the British Army, not the IRA?
I think it's quite clear from my point of view that if people, whether if they're in uniform, if they did not act correctly, then I'm sorry, I can't agree that they shouldn't be brought to book. Because what signal are we sending out? That it's all right to act out of order? We expect the highest standards from all great people in uniform. In terms of his comments about the leadership, it's very, very clear that my party is committed to our armed forces and not to any terrorist organisation.
Would he accept, however, and I think this is the point that the member opposite was trying to make, that every incident in which either the police or the army were involved and where there was a killing should not be treated as if it were a murder? Correct. And that's the inequality and what causes the anger that we have seen in so many families, that every killing by terrorists was no doubt a murder, it was illegal. But on many occasions, those incidents in which soldiers and policemen were involved were in protection of life and property, and therefore should not be treated by the authorities, as they are at present, as if there was something illegal involved in the incident.
Everyone knows, because we've worked together on these issues as well, that I'm very, very clear that it's obvious that the vast majority of the things that were done by our forces were not murder. But there's a process that has fallen apart. A process of investigation that we need to put back together again, that we need to get to the bottom so we can see it. If there are some cases that could be construed, and this is quite clearly in the agreements that people have signed up in the past to try and make this work, that we've got to get to the root of them and we've got to get them aired out in public. That's all that we are seeing. But I agree with him. The vast majority of things that were done were in no sense murder, not in any sense by the forces. In the interest, I'm going to make a bit of progress. In the interest of all the parties in Northern Ireland and the government, we must get the legacy stuff resourced and resolved properly. And I say this respect to the government that we in Labour accept there may well be some genuine issues on the national security front. But let's never ever use national security as a cover-up for wrongdoing by governments and other agencies of the state. And in saying that, I include my former colleagues in Labour governments as well as his in former Conservative governments.
Thank the member for giving way. And before he moves off the issue of legacy, he spent some time detailing a case, which is a legacy case. I challenge him to detail any other case that would balance the books in the way the honourable member from across the House indicated, that lists a unionist grievance. Does he know any unionist grievances?
I do, but I'm not prepared to do them today because I prepared that one, and I said at the beginning, I will tell him exactly, if he let us speak. I said I used that case because of how long ago it was. And I made it very, very clear. He probably wasn't listening. He usually does, but perhaps he wasn't. I make no differentiation between victims. Whoever they were, however they died, however they were injured, they all deserve the right to have a system put in place that lets the truth be known. And that is what is being failed by the politicians in Northern Ireland. You've failed to have a system that works properly. We've got to build genuine openness. We've got to build confidence and trust. If we don't, then people will not ever be able to move this country forward. And another issue I want to raise, and moving on from the legacy issue, is the discussions that have been taking place with political parties over the last few months about the abuse of the petition of concern. The petition of concern was put in place in the original agreement to allow a space for remedying issues that included the abuse of power by one community against another. It was to make sure that couldn't happen in the institutions. It's now being used as a veto for progress. This was not the intent, and we must try and get back to the original intent. Do you like it too?
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. On that particular point, I do agree with him. But a year ago, he may have been in the meeting, I don't know, when I had a meeting with the then First Minister Peter Robinson and the late Martin McGuinness and made that very point to them. They both defended the petition of concern process and both said that it worked well for each side. So I entirely agree with him, but that's what you tend to come up against.
I've got no doubt there's people who may want to use it for the purpose I said, i.e. a veto, and not a way of actually genuinely resolving problems, would say that. Of course they would. But I'm really at the House, the things I'm being told, as part and parcel of me trying in my little way to try and say, let's find a way to get this executive up and running again. That's what this is all about. It's not about scoring points. It's not about making points of what's happened 40 years ago. It's about saying, these are the issues that people are telling me, this is why we can't sit down with you. Well, I'm saying any reasonable human being should be able to try to find a way through this. And another one which I want to address is a point, again, where I believe a reasonable position could be reached. And that is around the Renewable Heat Initiative. The thing that we all told was the straw that brought the camel's back. The government should work with the parties over there to say, let's get the inquiry going, and when the inquiry comes out, we will work to make sure that any funding shortfall is not landed directly on the grounds of Northern Ireland, on the feet of Northern Ireland, unless it's in a way that can be managed over a period of time. That's very, very important, so we don't end up losing funding for vital public services while this is cleaned up. We need to see parties get trust to each other and move away from entrenched positions. And I'll say this to Sinn Féin, clean it from this box. Drop your demand for the leader of the DUP to stand aside while this inquiry goes on. I said to give assurances, which I believe she has, that she'll fully cooperate with the inquiry, she'll accept its outcomes, and she won't hinder its progress in any way. That will be a huge step in the direction of rebuilding the trust and confidence that allowed sworn enemies to govern in Northern Ireland in previous years. I hope that people will take what I've said today in the spirit it's meant to. It's meant to lay in front of this House the issues that I'm being told by people are the reasons why the system fell apart. Now, some people might be cynical and say that's not what the reasons. Well, no doubt we'll hear that over the next few hours. I'm referring back to this House. I'm reporting back to this House what I'm being told and what we should do to move forward. I'm sad that we're in a situation today where we've got a general election because the failure of the government to recognise the impact on reaching a resolution in Northern Ireland is sadly symptomatic of the approach taken by this government over the last 7 years. The lack of direct meaningful engagement by both the present and last Prime Minister have done nothing to show the people of Northern Ireland that they're little more than afterthought in this government's mind. It's no way to act in a situation that is still one of conflict resolution. The job done attitude just doesn't work. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome this legislation because it does provide more time for the parties to engage in discussions about the formation of executive. With a general election looming, it's apparent the government didn't think of the effect it would have on Northern Ireland. But thankfully this bill doesn't represent the return to direct rule, which it may well have. So I'm pleased we've got that out of the way, at least in the short term. It does set a regional rate that is necessary to fund the vital public services that have to be done in Northern Ireland, and it will fill the gap in the short term. But I call on all parties to do exactly what the Secretary of State said. When this bill gets royal assent, hopefully on Thursday, they sit down on Friday and they start working out. They look at the reality of what they're saying they can't resolve. And I would suggest every one of the things that I've laid out today can be resolved if people want to resolve them. If they don't want to resolve them, we'll be back here. Well, I won't be, but some people will be back here in a few weeks' time with things in possibly an even worse shape than what they are. And I sadly believe what we saw yesterday in Northern Ireland may well be repeated as a way of... We've tried 20 years to work together. It isn't working. It's never going to work. The only way is to go back to where we are. And none of us should want that. And none of us who have any say in this should let anything get in the way of stopping that happening.
Point of order, Mr Paisley.
Deputy Speaker, the Shadow Secretary, when he was making his speech, indicated that he was going to list a number of grievances and a number of issues to do with legacy. Could you confirm for us the time that we have left in this debate? Because obviously the Shadow Secretary believed that he was running out of time, and he does have sufficient time to make those lists available to the House.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order, and part of it I can answer. I would expect this part of this debate for the second reading debate to last until 16 minutes past 8. There is plenty of time. As to the content of the speech, indeed the valedictory speech made by the right honourable gentleman from the dispatch box, it is not a matter for me, but entirely a matter for the honourable gentleman, and I'm sure that if he has something further to add to what he's already said, he will find an opportunity in the next 3 hours to say it. We do, of course, have, hopefully later today, the third reading debate after the second reading debate, when I would expect to hear some more speeches from both sides of the House. Mr Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I join the Secretary of State in his condemnation of the actions which were taken yesterday. Another attempt to kill innocent men, women and children, and it is totally unacceptable in any part of the world. And to think that that is continuing in the United Kingdom is abhorrent to all right-thinking people, and I join him in his condemnation of that. Can I also congratulate him on the work he's done over the last few weeks, which probably seems like months to him. He has done his absolute utmost, I know, to bring the parties together in Northern Ireland to get the institutions up and running again. And can I thank him for keeping in touch with me as chairman of the Select Committee. It has been very useful that he's been able to do that, and I thank him for that, and I wish him well in his future discussions. Can I also pay tribute to the honourable member for Bladen on his performance over many, many years in this House, his work in many, many years, and I was very sorry to hear that he is going to not seek re-election to Parliament. He was a long-standing and very active and extremely good member of the Select Committee for many years before he took up his present position. He is, I can confirm, Madam Deputy Speaker, a tough negotiator, but he is a fair man, and it was a great pleasure working with him, and I wish him well for the future. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is unfortunate, though, that we have to be here yet again to discuss these matters. It's unfortunate that the rates have to be set from this place. That is not entirely democratic. It's not in any way satisfactory. Following an election where there was a high turnout of voters, we end up taking decisions here in this place which should be rightly taken in Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, it's worse than that, of course, because that is just a microcosm of a bigger situation. I do know there are individuals, there are businesses, there are many other people in Northern Ireland that really do see the breaking down of the institutions as a distraction from what they want to do. Only last week I had a meeting with a business that wants to expand, that wants to bring potentially hundreds of jobs to Northern Ireland, and they don't know where they are. They don't know what the situation is. They don't know how the planning process will work because it's a large application. They really do regret this situation, and it's not one that any of us want to find ourselves in, but here we are again. And I'm glad that the Secretary of State really did outline the options, because if agreement can't be found, he didn't actually use the words direct rule, but that is obviously what we're sliding towards if we cannot get the institutions up and running in Northern Ireland. It's not something I want to see happen. But what I do want to see happen is the concerns that the company raised with me last week, for example, addressed. I want them to be able to create the jobs in Northern Ireland without the distraction of election upon election upon election, or decisions being taken in a piecemeal way. That is not what those kind of people want. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Northern Ireland on a social visit, speaking to friends over there, actually Catholics, if that's an important factor. It is an important factor because of what I'm about to say. And they said to me, for goodness sake, Lawrence, get on with it, bring direct rule back, because that's the only way we're going to get any decisions taken. Now, they don't particularly want to see that. Most people probably don't want to see that. But if it's a choice between chaos and direct rule, people will go for direct rule. They have to do. And it's really unfortunate that we've got to that position. But can I just say to those who are likely to bring about that situation, and it's not people who are present in this chamber here today, in my belief, it's people who refuse to take their seats in this chamber, it really would be rather paradoxical, rather strange, that the one party that say they don't want rule from this place are actually the party that brings it about. I mean, how odd will that be? And let me just, perhaps if they're listening, inform them what direct rule really means. Because I was a shadow minister when we had direct rule in the previous parliaments. It doesn't mean, actually, that this chamber decides everything. It doesn't work like that, actually. What happens is there are committees upstairs of 20 or so members, handpicked by the whips, let's be honest, handpicked by the whips. Very few of those members would be from Northern Ireland because of the mathematics of it. And things, very important matters, are decided in those committees. Now, that is the reality of direct rule. And I would say to those who are getting in the way of the institutions being set up again, is that how you want Northern Ireland to be governed?
Well, you accept, of course, that Sinn Féin have got form on this issue, and that when they want to dodge, and this has maybe got some resonance in the current situation, when they want to dodge hard decisions, they're quite happy, despite their blitz-out rhetoric, to hand powers back to Westminster for the hard decisions to be made, as they did with welfare reform about a year and a half ago.
Well, the honourable gentleman makes, I think, a very good point. I don't know what their logic is. And when I say that, I genuinely don't know what their logic is, because, as I've said, they are the party that shout the loudest about their opposition to British rule, as they call it, and yet they seem to be the party that are about to bring it about. So I simply cannot understand the logic of that position. And, as I say, I don't want us to go down that road. And there is time yet to avoid that road. But I think that takes us on to the next point, and that is about power sharing. And I think all sides, if they sign up to power sharing, have to accept what that means. And it means working with people you don't necessarily like. It means working with people you don't necessarily want to work with. It means compromising on certain policies. You don't always get the exact policy that you want. And come to think about it, I suppose every political party is like that. We all have discussions within political parties. We all have disagreements on policy within political parties. We all have to work within political parties with people perhaps we don't want to work with. That's the reality of politics. That's the reality of many jobs. To be honest, you work in a company. Of course, you have to work with people you don't like. Of course, you have to work under policies that management set that you might not agree with. That is the nature of work. And if they're not prepared to accept those compromises, if they're going to run away every time there's a difference of opinion and take the ball home and bring the institutions down, it simply won't work. And I think they have to accept that. I think all parties, and I'm not just talking about one party, I think all parties have to accept that. So I wish, by all means.
Madam Deputy Speaker, is the member seriously, I'm not here to represent Sinn Féin, and I don't think I ever will want to be, but is the member seriously suggesting that we should have turned, all of us should have turned a blind eye to the crisis over the Renewable Heat Initiative and done nothing? The member is to my mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, ignoring the fact that this crisis was triggered by a serious issue of confidence that needs to be resolved and needs to be dealt with. And while other things have piled in, and we can throw abuse, and there's a lot of it coming from the bench here behind me, but the point is this: it serves no purpose, Madam Deputy Speaker. And if we're going to go forward, we need to restore devolution in Northern Ireland. And if we're going to do that, we have to behave in a sane and sensible and mature fashion and recognise the facts. Thank you.
It's also a pleasure working with the honourable gentleman on the Select Committee as well, and he brings a great deal of, if I may say so, a great deal of calm and common sense to it. And I understand fully what he's saying, and no, I'm not saying that should be brushed under the carpet. But I don't see why there could not have been an inquiry carried on with the then First Minister still in place. I think I certainly will in a moment, I think to risk bringing the whole institutions down on any issue, to be honest, on any issue, I don't think it's worth it. I think it's a big issue. It's worth, what was it, £500 million over 20 years? I don't think that's a big enough issue to bring the institutions down. No, I don't.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I commend him for all he has done as chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. Would he agree with me that at times we see double standards operating in Northern Ireland? In the constituency of South Belfast, we had a most brutal murder in a pub of a young man by members of the IRA. And as a result, this party and others questioned the ability of Sinn Féin and their fitness for government and confidence in that fitness. And yet the SDLP did nothing, absolutely nothing, to challenge Sinn Féin on that issue in terms of their fitness for government. Are there not double standards operating here? Is one murder not worth more than the RHI scandal?
Well, the Right Honourable Member raises a very important point, and it goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that we either accept that we have to work with people we don't like, we don't want to work with, or we don't. And if we don't accept that, there's no power sharing. It's as simple as that. And it is true. I'm afraid it is a very good point. I'm afraid it is a very good point that parties of both sides have had to work with people they don't want to work with. There are accusations about certain members of the Assembly. And if they were in this place and we had to work very closely with them, maybe we wouldn't like that either. But it has had to happen for the sake of devolution, for the sake of the institutions. And the Right Honourable Member is absolutely right to draw our attention to some of the terrible crimes which have been committed. I know the Shadow Minister has been questioned on quoting crimes from across the board. I know that he very much condemns crimes wherever they come from. Just this morning, the Select Committee is looking at concluding its report into Libyan-sponsored IRA activity, and I was just rereading the proposed document this morning without going into the details yet because the committee has not considered it. But in that draft report, there are many examples of IRA violence, of the way the IRA has torn lives apart. And just rereading some of those things just this morning in the car as I came down really does remind us of what has gone on in Northern Ireland and how unacceptable it was. And I don't want to get into the issue of the prosecution of the soldiers at this point. It's going off the central part of the debate. But, of course, one side in the conflict always referred to it as the war. And the reason they referred to it as the war because it excused the indiscriminate killing of men, women and children. That's why they called it a war. So one side had a war, and the other side are expected to go by the book, or by the yellow card to be precise. And that does seem to me to be a very, very unfair way of looking at this whole situation and the whole legacy issue, certainly.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I do count him as a friend in terms of his support that he gives to Northern Ireland down through many, many years. Does he accept tonight that the bill before the House has now tipped the scales in favour of direct rule? Tonight, people in Ulster will be watching their televisions, and it is this House is setting their rates. For the last 10 years, it has been the Northern Ireland Assembly that has set the rates bill. And with that balance being tipped, with each piece of legislation as it comes forward, it's going to make it harder and harder to get back to devolution.
Well, I think my right honourable friend puts his finger on the problem. Yes, it is a slippery slope. In some ways, the bill offers the opportunity, though, as well, for people to get together and reform the executive. It does allow for that to happen. That is part of the bill as well. But the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. And it's actually not this whole House that's going to decide the rates. I think it's going to be, and with respect to him, is the only way he could do it, is the Secretary of State. So it goes back to what I said about direct rule earlier. Actually, all honourable members, right honourable members, won't get a say on the detail of things, whereas if it was set in Northern Ireland, there'd be much more involvement by local people. So that would be, indeed, would be far better. I want to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by just making this point. I really do hope that the Secretary of State, some way or other, is able to get the parties together in Northern Ireland so we avoid committees upstairs running Northern Ireland, which is, as I've said, most unsatisfactory. If he does, or even if he doesn't, I've said this in the House before, I really do think we need to look at some of the Belfast Agreement, the legislation, to see if it needs updating. Now, that is not in any way to undermine the principles of power sharing or anything else. It's actually an attempt to make it work, because at the moment it isn't working, or else we wouldn't be sat here now. And we wouldn't have been in crisis 18 months ago either. And I don't want everything to be set up only to find another crisis in 6 or 12 months. So I really do think, and the Shadow Secretary of State touched on it earlier about the petition of concern issue, which I did raise and was told that the parties were happy with it at that time. But I do think that needs looking at, but I think an awful lot else needs looking at, so we modernise it, so we update it, so that the whole arrangement is able to address the situation that we find ourselves in now and not the one we were in 20 years ago. Because without a doubt, a lot of progress has been made in Northern Ireland. We can't deny that. We shouldn't want to deny that. But we have to get the political process right as well, because if we don't, what will happen is people will completely lose faith in it. And that's in nobody's interests. Thank you.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And firstly, can I associate myself with the comments of the Secretary of State about the terrible discovery made yesterday, and indeed commend all the emergency services and the police for their tremendous efforts on their community's behalf. And indeed also for his words about the Shadow Secretary of State, the member for Blaydon, stepping down not only from this position, but that of the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland. His efforts in both remits are very much appreciated. I'll be very brief, Madam Deputy Speaker. The SNP will support the passage of this bill. The decisions being made would be better made on the other side of the Irish Sea, but we are where we are, and it's important to get rateable values set so the administration of public services can continue. There are Brexit difficulties coming down the road, especially around the border issues, and it's right to do all we can to minimise the turbulence, but these decisions should more properly be made in Stormont. There is a real need to get the political administration in Stormont back up and running, and I'm fairly sure that the electorate that's being asked to go back to the polls for a snap general election so soon after a snap Stormont election will be urging a resolution to the negotiations and a resumption of administration duties. Getting an administration running so that decisions are taken there rather than here would be the best option all around, and that should be our main aim. As I said, the SNP will support this bill.
Owen Paterson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by echoing previous comments, particularly by the Secretary of State, on the vile and cowardly bomb left outside the Holy Cross Primary School in the Ardoyne, and commend all those in the security forces who handled the incident and who are handling similar incidents 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, and we all owe them a great debt of thanks for the manner in which they continue to police Northern Ireland. And can I also pay tribute to their predecessors who created the conditions under intensely difficult circumstances, under quite extraordinary provocation, which enabled the peace process to take place. And on that basis, I wholly commend the comments of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, who has shown remarkable forbearance and patience, has been abused and criticised, I think quite unfairly in recent weeks, and has let himself in for a further extension through to the 29th of June, which I think is a wholly sensible measure. And he quite rightly said there isn't a single member that I know in this House who would like to see direct rule return. And as the Shadow Secretary of State, sadly in his last valedictory performance, we will miss him in the next Parliament, quite rightly concurred as well, there is nobody here that wants direct rule to come back. There's a slightly daft narrative that there are some sort of crazy Brits that really want to reimpose. Absolutely not. The institutions were set up and the Belfast Agreement passed after the most extraordinary period of negotiation, man-years of effort, and bipartisan agreement in this House, when members of Conservative administrations made intensely difficult decisions, which were supported by the Labour opposition, and in turn, when Labour came to power, we were in opposition and we supported the Labour government. And I had the honour to be the Shadow Secretary when the last major element went through, which is the devolution of policing and justice. And we backed Labour all the way. And you saw a similar process in Dublin, where both main parties consistently supported the process. And of course, none of this could have happened without the extraordinary support of both parties in the United States of America. And there is now exasperation that we have come to this point. There's been such progress made. And I would like to speak up for those hard-working people on the ground in Northern Ireland, because I still go to Northern Ireland. The Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley and I appeared on Spotlight about 3 weeks ago. And a lady in the audience made a very good question, straight at me. She said, "What's going to happen about our budget? Who is going to pay our bills?" And that was exactly the right question to be posed, because she, along with many others, had probably voted in the election on March the 2nd to elect politicians, local politicians, to make these decisions. None of us want to make these decisions for those local politicians. It is completely exasperating. And I go and see the most wonderful, world-class businesses who are trying to attract investment to Northern Ireland, who are travelling on behalf of Northern Ireland, representing hard-working, brilliantly skillful Northern Ireland people. And what's the international message? Delighted to give way.
Giving way, and will he accept that maybe there is a longer-term strategy that is now re-emerging from Sinn Féin, and that is to make Northern Ireland unstable, so that the people of Northern Ireland actually start questioning Northern Ireland's ability to govern itself, and maybe it's a tactic of theirs that they are re-emerging into?
I don't think I'd like to comment on the motives of any political party. I'd just like to say, as someone who's been involved in Northern Ireland, I was involved 3 years as the Shadow Secretary of State and 3 years as the real Secretary of State. There is such goodwill there amongst the populace across all parts of the community. I don't like talking about communities, I like to talk about the whole community. There is longing for this to work and real goodwill, and now there is utter exasperation. And I'm particularly exasperated because my great project, which, with representatives of 4 local parties, and the 5th one also was supportive, was the ability to give the ability of Northern Ireland politicians to set corporation tax, because we know that the Republic of Ireland's determination, in the face of intense criticism actually from other major member states of the EU, to hold on to its right to set corporation tax, has been the key to their success. And the then Finance Minister in Dublin, when I was there, said it was the cornerstone of their success. And of course, as part of what was called the Azores Agreement, it was vital that there is a democratically elected institution in a devolved area to make that decision. So for me, having got this through, having got complete unity amongst Northern Ireland parties, having got